This all started about an hour ago. It was supposed to be my day off, and I had already planned to lay around in my house and eat junk food all day long. I hauled a bunch of snacks and drinks to the living room, not feeling even a bit of regret over the few pounds I was about to put on. I turned on the TV and jumped on the couch, scrolling through Facebook while a movie played in the background on the screen. It must have been about 5 o'clock when I got bored and decided to stretch my legs a little. When I returned from my excuse for a healthy smoke break, I saw that the movie on the TV was gone, and was instead replaced with one of those emergency broadcast screens with colorful rectangles. A male voice responded from the TV.
"Repeat, do not leave your homes under any circumstances. This is not a drill. Repeat, this is not a drill."
5-second pause.
"Attention citizens, this is an emergency broadcast. For your own safety, please lock your doors and windows immediately. And do not leave your home under any circumstances. Repeat, do not leave your home under any circumstances. This is not a drill. Repeat, this is not a drill."
The message kept replaying. I flicked through the channels only to be met with static. At first, I laughed at the absurdity of the situation. This can't be real, can it? And then it hit me. Maybe we were under attack. North Korea, or maybe another terrorist attack. In any case, I turned off the TV and decided to lock my doors and shut all the windows, covering them with blinds along the way. Before I did though, I peered out the window only to be greeted with an empty street and nothing suspicious. I sat back on my couch and messaged my friend on Facebook, asking him if he had saw the same broadcast. He didn't respond though, and Messenger said that he was online 10 minutes ago. As I scrolled through the rest of the feed, I saw nothing out of the ordinary on my friend's pages. I googled the news looking up my town, but there was nothing. I started to relax a little, beginning to think this was indeed all either a prank or a technical error. But then I heard something outside. It sounded like someone cackling, but it only lasted for about a second before it stopped. I held my breath and listened, hearing another cackle in the process, equally short and disturbing, and then a feminine scream that was suddenly cut off. It was as if whoever was screaming was suddenly muted with the pause of a button. I approached the door carefully, looking through the peephole, but I saw nothing out of the ordinary. And then, another very short and barely audible scream. I decided to go to the window, thinking I might see more. I slowly pulled the blinds aside, just enough to see a portion of the street, and my heart almost exploded. Standing right in front of me, with her face to the glass, was a woman, staring right at me. Her eyes were bloodshot and opened so widely that they looked like they were going to pop out. She was snarling, showing teeth that were stained with dark red liquid, and causing the window to fog up every second or so. Her hair was messy and her nails caked with dirt. I screamed and backed away, knocking down my table lamp in the process. I stood there for a while, staring at the blinds, knowing that the woman was just behind them, since I could occasionally hear a faint tap and scratch on the glass with her nails. And then she spoke. "Open the door, please, please, they'll find me." I stood there dumbfounded. "Please, I know you're in there. Just open the door, please." I reached for my phone and dialed 911 with trembling hands, but was met with a dead line. I tried a few times, but there was no service. "Please, let me in." "Let us in." A male voice joined the woman at the window, and then another one at the door, and another, until my entire house was surrounded by a reverberating cacophony of pleading voices, some desperate sounding, and others impatient and aggressive. I retreated to the stairs, waiting for them to go away. After what seemed like an eternity, they started shutting up one by one until I was left with a deafening silence I was grateful for. Did they get bored and decide to leave me alone? I decided to peer out my peephole to see if it was safe. When I did, I barely stopped myself from gasping loudly. Through the peephole, I could see a middle-aged man's face with bloodshot eyes, just standing there, not moving, staring at my door. Around him were more people, just staring blankly at the walls and windows. I backed away and would approach the door every few minutes since then. They've been standing in front of my house for 5 hours now. I waited and waited. I foolishly kept glancing outside to see if they had left. It was almost dark and I felt like I was losing my mind. I even contemplated opening the door, thinking they might not want to harm me. And as a last resort, I held my kitchen knife close so that I could try to fight them off, or in the worst case scenario, slit my wrists. Thoughts raced through my head about them breaking in and ripping me apart limb by limb with their bare hands, so I didn't want to find out what they planned to do to me and how creative they were. As I sat there trying not to make any noise, I decided to peer outside one last time. Looking outside, I was faced with the same people, standing in the same position, still staring at my house. But then, there was a sound. Something that sounded like 3 deliberate gunshots a few blocks away. Almost instantly, the people jerked their heads towards the sound and without any hesitation started sprinting towards the source. Some of them screaming along the way or making animalistic sounds. I thought there may have been 10 or 20 of them surrounding my house, but I was wrong. As I was looking through the peephole to see them leaving, more and more of them just kept running past my house, almost for a whole minute, which made me think for a moment that the horde would never end. But eventually all went still, and there was no person or sound remaining anywhere in the vicinity of my house. That's it, I'm safe, I thought. I put my back against the door and breathed a sigh of relief. And then, I heard another voice. I looked back through the peephole and saw someone across the street. A black woman and a middle-aged man were moving cautiously towards my house in a crouched position. The woman had an axe and the man seemed to be carrying a baseball bat. "Come on, they'll be back soon." The woman gestured for the man to follow her, and they stopped right in front of my house. "Hey, you there." She tried to speak quietly, but loud enough for me to hear. "Hey." She knocked on the door. "You need to come out now. Those lunatics will be back soon." I clutched the knife harder and held my breath. "Look, we're not one of them. Now come on, open the door." "He's not gonna open." The man shook his head. "Come on, let's go." Maybe it was the fact that I desperately wanted not to be alone anymore in that moment. But I quickly unlocked the door and opened it slightly. "Hey!" I called out to them from behind the door, concealing the knife. "Finally," the lady said. "Come on, they'll be back soon. We need to evacuate." "Wait, the broadcast said we needed to stay inside," I argued. "Screw that, there's no help coming. "No, come on, we're leaving to the evac site without you." I knew there was no time to argue, and much less time to prepare supplies to bring before those freaks returned. So I just locked my house and left the keys in the nearby bushes. "I'm Angela, by the way, and this is Travis," the lady said. "It should be safe to leave the neighborhood this way." I introduced myself and asked what was going on. "Don't know exactly, people just started acting crazy. The town's been quarantined, but there's one checkpoint where we can get out." "They got soldiers there," Travis said with his raspy voice. "Should be safe to wait for this to blow over outside town." "How do you know?" I asked. "I don't for sure, but it's our best bet." "First we gotta find our guy," Angela said. "He insisted on firing a few shots to distract them and save your ass. He'll meet us at the gas station." The walk to the gas station was uneventful. The streets were empty, but we did see crashed cars and a few bodies from a distance. I had never seen a corpse before, let alone mangled and butchered ones like these. So I tried to look away and not think how these people died. No crazy people were on the street though, or anyone alive for that matter. When we got to the station, there was a young man waiting there. He couldn't have been more than 18. "Ricky, nice work back there," Angela greeted him. "Here's the guy you were risking your ass for." "I owe you one, man." I shook his hand and awaited for the group to give further instructions. "Hey Travis, you okay?" Angela asked him, and when I glanced at him, I saw that he was pale. "Yeah, just tired is all. I'm gonna use the restroom," he replied and disappeared into the gas station. Ricky suggested that we scavenge the remaining food in the station, so we went inside. The inside of the gas station looked like it was left in a panicked hurry. Some of the items were knocked over. The floor stained with liquid from broken bottles. The majority of the shelves left pillaged. Ricky assured us that he had already scouted the place, and that it was safe, but I still felt uneasy, as if one of those people would jump me from around the corner. I gathered whatever I deemed necessary, like chocolate bars, chips, water, and of course, cigarettes. You never know when you might need them. I went into the restroom to take a leak when I heard a loud crash from inside. "Travis, you okay?" I called out to him. I heard his voice, but he didn't respond. It sounded like he was having a heated discussion with someone. "Travis?" I heard him from inside one of the stalls, so I called out his name. He was whispering loudly, murmurs that I couldn't make out. I carefully approached the stall and stopped, listening to him. I was able to grab only a few phrases in his indistinct chatter, like, "Can't get away," "Out, out, out," and "Feed them to something." "Hey Travis, are you okay in there?" I asked, and against my better judgment, decided to slowly open the door. Before I even realized what was going on, Travis burst out of the stall and jumped on top of me, knocking me on my back. I held him back as he thrashed against me. His face was all red and his eyes were bloodshot, veins bulging from his neck and forehead so violently that they looked like they would explode in any moment. "Outside, no control. Find the host." He screamed the gibberish, his spit flying all over me. "Get off me." I tried to pull him off, but he was too strong. The door of the bathroom burst open, and Angela and Ricky ran in, shouting at Travis to stop it. A few moments of frenetic screaming, shouting, and struggling, and then Travis went completely limp. I pushed him off, only then realizing that there was a fire axe embedded in his forehead. His eyes were wide open, still bloodshot, and a pool of blood was forming on the floor around his head. I backed away to the wall, breathing heavily, and as the adrenaline subsided, I started to feel a burning sensation all over my arms. I had deep scratches and spit from Travis all over me. Oh no. No, no, no. I stared at the scratches, my hands trembling uncontrollably. This is it, I thought. All those zombie movies I watched, and this was how it ends. Damn it, Travis. I barely heard Angela say while standing over his body. She and Ricky discussed something, but I was in my own world then. Hey, you okay? Angela shook me out of my trance. He infected me, I said with a trembling voice. You're fine, she responded. But the virus. He scratched me, and I think I got some of his spit in my mouth and on my wounds. This isn't a virus. Angela shook her head. It's a parasite, and we all have it inside of us. Parasite? I was still in shock from everything that had just happened. I thought you said you didn't know what was going on. Angela sighed. I work for the town's pharmaceutical company as a secretary. When this all started today, I got a message on my company phone from my coworker Daniel. He was very vague, but he told me not to go into work today. That it's not safe in town. He said there's a people-killing parasite which is immune to medication, and that we all have it, so we should take antibiotics to suppress its growth. That's all I know.
What?
Ricky interjected.
That's crazy.
I know how it sounds. Angela continued. Look, Daniel is a researcher at the lab, so I'm sure he knows more than we do, and he's not one to exaggerate. Where is he now? I asked. He hasn't responded to any of my messages. For all we know, he could already be dead. And the last thing he sent me was that we should evacuate via the bridge. He said that the army would be there. Our best bet is to reach the evac point. But if we're all infected, there's no way we can leave town, I said. I know, Angela responded. Look, the government is organizing an evacuation for a reason. They might have a cure for this, or at least a temporary solution. Ricky and I agreed. I asked about finding some guns, but they disagreed, stating it would be suicide. Those freaks were very perceptive, and firing even a single bullet could swarm hundreds of them on us in a matter of seconds. That meant that cars were out of the question too. They also told me that they also seemed to work as a beehive, cooperating really well with each other and not attacking their own. On top of all that, they seemed to retain some form of intelligent thinking, which explained their behavior in front of my house. By the time we stocked up with food and water, it was already dark, but Angela suggested we move now for better cover. The checkpoint was supposedly not far away, so it wouldn't take longer than an hour to reach it. We each took one antibiotic pill, which Angela had on her, hoping against hope that it would slow down the parasite until we reached the checkpoint. I expected the town to be filled with screams and other inhuman sounds made by those things. And I was right. The sounds were distant but always present around us. A scream here, a crash there, putting all three of us on edge. Carefully taking every step and frantically looking behind and around us. At one point, there was a loud scream right behind us, and as we turned around, we saw a naked man running 1 block away and disappearing around the corner. We waited, not sure if he was toying with us. A few seconds later, another scream was heard from the adjacent street where the man had just vanished. The next few seconds were a mixture of two screams, one violent and blood-curdling, the other pleading, along with the sound of loud pummeling, until the latter was the only sound that remained. I wanted to help whoever was in trouble there, but Angela stopped me and silently shook her head. All three of us just moved on without a single word to each other. As we neared the bridge, the horrid sounds around us slowly started fading away, until the only sound remaining was our footsteps echoing throughout the street. After an excruciating hour of sneaking, and praying that we don't run into one of those people who would attract others, we finally made it to the bridge. There was a makeshift barricade made from barbed wire and cement bags. There were dozens of corpses strewn about the road in front of and on the bridge itself. One even slumped across the barricade, making the entire scene look like a war massacre. We ducked behind a wall and observed the bridge. On the other side of it, at the end of the street, was a tall wall, which hadn't been there before. I remember asking myself how the hell they managed to block off an entire city so quickly. "Do you see anyone there?" Angela asked. "It looks deserted." I squinted my eyes, trying to detect any sign of movement across the bridge. "Army guys must be ahead. Let's check it out," Ricky said. "Wait, we have to be careful here," Angela interjected. "What if there's no checkpoint at all? Or if they mistake us for one of those lunatics?" "What choice do we have? We're running out of time here. I'll go first. Stay behind me and watch our backs." Ricky stood up and started towards the bridge. Before Angela or I could argue any further, we watched as Ricky jumped over the barricade with great finesse, and we followed, carefully stepping around the dead bodies and pools of dried blood. Looking at the corpses made me feel uneasy. There were women and children here, mothers embracing their children in their final moments. Angela mumbled, "Oh my God," to herself next to me and said, "Were all these people trying to evacuate, but didn't make it?" "I don't know." I shook my head. But these people were definitely not the freaks. I inadvertently started to think about what could have happened here, and how these people felt in those last moments. Just as I was about to entertain that morbid thought, Ricky called out to us from across the bridge. Guys?" He was kneeling over one of the dead bodies on the road. "I don't think there's gonna be an evac." "What do you mean?" I asked. He pointed to the body he was inspecting, and then stood up, putting his arms on his hips. "These bodies have bullet holes in them." He gestured to us. "I think this was the army's doing." What happened next was too fast for my brain to process. There was a glint on top of the wall, Angela screaming Ricky's name, a loud bang that echoed through the street, and Ricky's head kicking forward from the bullet's impact as he went limp and fell down without a sound. The poor kid probably never even realized what hit him. "Contact!" We heard someone yell from the wall as a hail of bullets started being fired in our direction, barely missing us by a thread. Angela and I quickly stumbled backwards, running for our lives frantically, while the sound of bullets persisted. We ran for what felt like miles until the gunshots faded, and then finally stopped completely. We stopped in the middle of a street, breathing heavily and trying to process what the hell just happened. But the silence didn't last for long, because the sound of bullets was quickly replaced with a different, equally ominous one. The screams of the freaks which froze your bones to the marrow, bringing along with them impending doom. Their death cries were all around us now, and they were drawing closer by the second. I frantically looked around for some desperate way out of this situation. The screams were so loud now that I expected the freaks to appear from around the corner. I noticed a small store with an open sign on the door, so I tried it with all my strength, hoping to God it was unlocked. To my surprise, the door easily gave way, making me stumble headfirst inside. "Angela, come on!" I called out to my surviving partner, who seemed to be preoccupied, frantically looking around, clutching her axe. "Angela!" I yelled again, and she snapped her head to me and practically jumped inside. I shut the door and ducked behind the counter just in time to see a dozen freaks run past us on the street, all screaming along the way and muttering some gibberish, just like Travis did. Angela and I silently stared at each other, breathing heavily and probably thinking the same thing. What the hell just happened? The gunshots started again, but were very distant this time. The screamers all seemed to be flocking to the sound of gunfire, which was good for us. A few more minutes passed as we listened to the cacophony of bullets and screaming, with an occasional freak running past the store. Eventually, Angela and I started to regain our composure when all the outside noise died down. "They shot Ricky," she said, looking down. "They shot him." "Listen, we need to keep moving." I approached her, glancing at the street every couple of seconds. "We're not safe here, and evacuating obviously isn't happening. Do you know of any other safe places?" She thought for a second, and her eyes closed, as if she had trouble recalling. The only place I know is my company," she finally responded. "It's got pretty good security, but I don't know how safe it is there now. Other staff members could be infected there." "It's our only option now. The pharmaceutical company isn't far from here, right?" "Yeah, we should be there in no time. I have an access card." She finally seemed to snap out of her trance and focus. "Alright, here's what we do. We go to your company, we wait it out a few days. If it has good security, maybe your coworker Daniel and some other people could be working on a cure, right?" "I don't know, it's a long shot. They could all be dead or gone by now, and the building overrun." "Look, your coworker is the only one who told you this was a parasite, and that we can slow it down with antibiotics. He might, just might, know something more. And since the government doesn't plan to let us out, we might as well see if we can get treated first and then look for another way out." Okay, she nodded. "Let's go check it out. If there's even the slightest chance of survivors being there, we need to get there. And if it's deserted, we can still stay there for a bit, until we figure out our next move. And if the freaks are there, we'll cross that bridge when we get to it, right? Let's go." I clutched Travis's baseball bat and peeked outside through the glass door. It looked safe enough, so we slowly exited the store and started making our way to the destination. "The pharmaceutical company is at an intersection, so we gotta be real careful," Angela said. Sure enough, as soon as we exited the alleys and reached the main street, we saw a bunch of freaks scattered on the road, aimlessly walking around abandoned cars and dead bodies. Their footsteps looked unnatural, almost as if they forgot how to walk and were now learning it from scratch. From time to time they would scream, shout some gibberish, or even violently cough and retch. "We can use the garage to get to the entrance," Angela said, and pointed to a security barrier which opened to an underground garage. Carefully, we descended down, making sure we made as little noise as possible. The outside noises faded once we reached the bottom, which greatly improved our morale. A lot of cars over here seemed untouched. Only a couple of vehicles were crashed and left like that. So whoever had parked here never had the chance to escape. We stuck to the walls, and it's a good thing too, because as soon as we heard another discontinued scream, we froze in our tracks, trying to identify where it was coming from. But it was difficult due to the echo and the size of the garage. Another scream echoed. Have they found us? We waited for what seemed like ages, but nothing happened. I decided to take a peek and realized there was one man in a business suit, standing in the middle of the garage. He was facing away from us, just standing and his head twitching every now and then in an uncontrolled motion. "The door is right there," Angela whispered, pointing to the left of the freak. I thought about sneaking past him, and there was a good chance we could have made it, but it was a gamble. "Give me your axe," I told her, as she hesitantly gave it to me, asking what I was doing. I looked around again to see if anyone was in the garage, but it seemed clear. "Stay here until I take care of him, and if he sees me, don't try to help me. We're just both gonna get killed." I inhaled deeply and started taking very slow steps towards the freak. I held my breath, afraid that even the slightest noise would alert him. The freak shrieked and then went silent. He hadn't seen me yet. Step by step I got closer, and as I did, I was able to hear him more clearly. The freak was muttering something between moans and head jerks. No, can't do it. Break free," he said among other things. I was only a few feet away from him now. He screamed loud, which made me stop dead in my tracks. My heart was pounding 1,000,000 miles per hour. This is it, I thought. He's gonna turn around in a matter of seconds. His friends will join in and rip me apart. But he just went silent again and continued doing what he was doing before. I gripped the axe as tightly as I could, exhaling slightly and bracing myself. Before I could give myself the chance to chicken out, I raised the axe above my head and brought it down with full force. The freak jerked his head in my direction one last time, just in time to see me, but it was too late. The axe connected with his collarbone, bringing him down to his knees with blood spurting everywhere. He tried to open his mouth to utter something, but only a soft gasp came out before he fell sideways, his eyes still open as the pool of blood started to form around him. Oh damn, I gasped at the sudden realization of what I had just done. I suddenly felt sick, and had I eaten prior to that, I would have emptied the contents of my stomach. I had just killed a human being. I stared at the dead body for what seemed like ages, thinking about whether this man had a family and what his name was, until I felt a tap on my shoulder. "Hey, we gotta go," Angela reminded me, and I nodded, unable to say a word. She snatched her axe from the dead body and said, "You had to do it. If you hadn't killed him, you bet your ass he would have done it to you." She approached the door and swiped her card on the reader, which made a loud beeping sound. The sturdy door unlocked. I took one final look at the man in the suit and his empty gaze, before Angela reminded me that we had to go. "Thank God," she sighed as the door closed behind us. A male voice suddenly responded on the loudspeaker.
"Angela, is that you?"
"Daniel?" she responded, looking around for the source. A moment of silence and the voice crackled back to life.
"Come on up to the second floor. I have something important to show you." "Well, come on. It's safe," the voice repeated. "I'm in the security room."
Angela and I looked at each other in bewilderment. She led us upstairs to the second floor through the once pristine hallways that were now decorated with knocked over garbage bins, broken vending machines, and from what I could see, some staff members. We rounded the corner and reached the door with the security sign. Angela was about to open the door, but I stopped her, recalling how they surrounded my house and tried to trick me into letting them in. For all we knew, Daniel was already dead, or worse. But before we could consider our next move, the door swung open and in front of us appeared a man in a lab coat, staring us down.
"Took you long enough,"
he said in a matter-of-factly tone, and went back inside the room. We followed. Inside were dozens of monitors which were tracking movement via surveillance cameras throughout the building. I noticed movement on some of the feeds from those freaks, walking aimlessly about through certain sections of the building and outside, just like the ones we saw on the street earlier. Daniel sat in the security guard's chair and faced us. I only then noticed the gun next to him on the desk. "Dan, I thought you were dead," Angela said.
"My thoughts exactly. I heard the army's killing our own. So when I told you to go there," he shook his head. "I tried contacting you again to prevent you from going there, but I couldn't reach you. I'm sorry. I should have known."
Angela shrugged after a moment of silence. "Dan, you said that this was some sort of parasite. Is there a cure for it?" she asked.
"There's no cure,"
he responded with hesitation, and my heart dropped.
"You can slow it down with antibiotics, but even then it's just a matter of time before the parasite develops resistance. We tried finding a cure, but we failed."
"What is this parasite?" I asked. Dan sighed and nodded.
"Ever heard of Toxoplasma gondii?"
he asked. I didn't respond.
"Toxoplasma gondii," Dan repeated. "A parasite which can only thrive in the intestines of cats. It infects a rat and takes over its mind. It then allows the rat to become easy prey and be eaten by the cat, which ingests the parasite and voila! It lives a happy life. Now, the parasite itself doesn't harm humans. It causes some minor behavioral changes, yes, but people can live with it without even knowing they have it."
"This wasn't all just an accident, was it?" Angela and I listened carefully, holding our breaths.
"No,"
Dan sighed, looking embarrassed.
"No, it wasn't."
He continued after a short pause.
"The government was highly intrigued by the psychological changes T. Gandhi caused in humans. So they thought, what if we could control the parasite and use it to our advantage? So they established a fake pharmaceutical company in this town and moved us to conduct the project here. They hired some citizens like Angela to retain the image of a normal company. But behind the scenes we were experimenting with Tigandi. But why? I asked. Why use it? Lots of reasons. But the main one was creating an obedient and compliant nation. That was the initial goal, at least. After the initial success of manipulating Tigandi and making sure the behavioral changes it caused in humans would be the ones they desired, the guys in command gave orders to start infecting citizens. What? Angela was appalled. He took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes. We administered the parasite via throat swabs and tongue dispensers. You probably remember the precautions the town had in order to prevent a possible Ebola outbreak 5 months ago. All citizens had to complete a mandatory throat culture and were therefore infected without even knowing it. The ones who moved out of the city in the meantime were tracked carefully. They've probably been neutralized or arrested by now. I thought about all this for a second. I never took the throat culture, I replied. How? Dan asked. I hadn't moved here by then. Well then, unless you ingest some feces which contain this specific parasite, you're safe. I felt a surge of new hope. I felt as if I could run for miles. Dan continued. Anyway, everything was fine at first. The town's crime rates started dropping, more stabilities in the city, and so on. In fact, it was going so well that the top guys planned on running another experiment in which they could engineer the parasite into causing different behavioral changes and use it as a weapon of mass destruction. But then things got out of hand? Angela asked. Yes. People started complaining about feeling sick, and then there were reports of violent attacks and, well, you know the rest. I've observed some of the infected, and apparently what happens is exactly like with the rats. The parasite takes control over the host. I don't know if the host is still aware, but my guess is he is. Probably like some other parasites. The host just can't control his actions. So why would the parasite cause this kind of violent behavior? I asked. My guess is they want full control. They probably control most of the neurons in the host, but not all of them. My mind went back to all the things I had heard. The freaks kept saying since this all began, find the host, no control, out. See this? Dan pointed to the camera feed, on which we saw a freak at the front entrance twitching and holding his head, as if he was in pain. Whatever human is left in that body is fighting for control, but the parasite is too strong. He turned back to us. After the outbreak, the government announced evac at a few checkpoints in the city, but they changed their plans when they realized the severity of the situation. Our research team was to be extracted in case of an outbreak, but they never showed up, leaving us here to die. All those years working for them, and this is how they repay us. He stood up and paced around. He raised his index finger and continued. But the government doesn't know one thing. They moved their research here. The team was aware of a potential outbreak, and the head of research built a secret exit unbeknownst to his superiors. That's how most of the staff escaped from here. They're outside the city already, no doubt. Wait, and they got out? Angela interrupted. Daniel reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a key. This key was given only to the research team. He gave it to Angela. Inside the storage on the second floor basement is a fenced off area, which you can open with this key. From there, it's a straight shot from the sewers to freedom. The superiors were always told it was a waste dump, so they never suspected anything.
"Wait, what about you?" she asked. He smiled vaguely and sat back down.
"There's no escape from what I've done. This is my purgatory. You better go. It's only a matter of time before the government purges the city." Just then, a loud crash was heard downstairs. All three of us glanced at the camera feed, only to see the freaks crashing through the glass doors at the entrance.
"Looks like we're out of time," Dan said and shoved his gun to Angela. "Dan," Angela started, but he raised his hand and silenced her.
"Go,"
he said impatiently.
"I'll distract them for you."
Without hesitation, Angela and I sprinted down the corridor, which already had screams reverberating through it, and called the elevator. We waited, hoping it would arrive before the freaks did, and when it finally did, we jumped in and hit the B2 button. The last thing we heard before the doors closed was Dan's voice shouting, "Over here, you infected freaks!" and the screams becoming even more violent, if that was even possible. The sound of their footsteps and screams echoed through the pipes all around the elevator as we descended, and we prayed it wouldn't stop before reaching the basement. The screams grew weaker, and a few seconds later the doors opened, and we stood in a dark hallway. Another very loud shriek echoed as one freak came right at us, but before he could reach us, Angela put a bullet in his forehead, silencing him permanently. We sprinted through the dark basement until we reached a sturdy-looking door. She used the key to open it and ushered me into the dark, cluttered room which was the storage. On the other side of the room was a gated fence, which led to a dark passage. Angela unlocked it and motioned for me to go first. I rushed inside, and as I did, I heard the sound of a door closing and a key turning in the hole. I turned around and saw Angela standing behind the gate, a look of defeat on her face. "Angela, what are you doing?" I asked. She shook her head. "This is the end of the line for me." "Angela, wait. Maybe you're okay. I can already feel myself changing," she cried. "You have to go without me." I was at a loss for words. I knew she was right, but my brain was looking for an alternative solution. Angela wiped her tears and reached into her pocket, pulling out a picture. She glanced at it and let out a loud sob. She then handed it to me, and upon inspecting, I saw it was a picture of a little girl in a school uniform, smiling widely. "That's my daughter, Helena," she said. "Her address is on the back. Please, find her and give it to her." "Angela, come on, you can give it to her yourself once we're out." The screams in the distance were starting to grow louder again. She shook her head and sniffled, wiping away her newly formed tears. "Promise me." She grabbed my hand through the fence firmly. "Promise me you'll find her." I nodded and uttered the words with a trembling voice. "I promise." "Good. I'm gonna give these bastards a memorable farewell." She dropped her backpack on the ground and readied her gun. The screams, which we had heard on the upper floors prior to this, were now permeating the basement in full force. "Angela," I called out to her, and she looked back at me. "Thank you," I said. She nodded and disappeared out of the room. The next few seconds were a mixture of screams and gunshots, until all that remained were just the screams. I closed my eyes and wiped the tears. I barely had the motivation to move, but I knew I had to go. I had to get out and find Helena. The next few hours were a blur, trudging through smelly water in the sewers, with barely a sense of direction, until I finally saw rays of sunlight coming through bars of another fenced gate. It was unlocked luckily, and I stepped outside into a canal. I heard the whirling of a helicopter and looked above in time to see it flying under the morning sun in the direction of the city. I glanced back, seeing the city, which was now blocked off by huge walls and military vehicles around it. They were far away from me though, so I was safe. I pulled out Angela's picture to make sure it was still in my pocket, and looked at the back of it. Below the address was Angela's personal message, scrawled in a hurry. It read, "Mommy will always be proud of you, even if it means I can't always be there for you. I love you more than anything, baby. Mom. P.S. Listen to your dad while I'm not around." I suppressed the tears which I felt welling up in my eyes and put the picture back in my pocket. I changed my identity after that. News of the outbreak spread quickly, and the media showed the death toll, with the names of all of the people who had died, including my own. The CBDC explained the incident to the media as an unfortunate outbreak of an unknown virus. They further mentioned that the city had to be completely sterilized, and the situation was now under control. According to the news, there were no survivors. Hey guys, thanks again for making it to the end of the video. Be sure to check out the author's book, which I'll link below in the description. If you enjoyed the story, be sure to leave a like and a comment, and let me know what you thought of it. I recently transferred to a Louisiana police department. I don't wish to share the city where I work, because this tale cannot get back to my boss. I'm certain she'd think that I wasn't all there if she heard what I saw in the Bayou. While looking for a body, the new city was a bit of a culture shock, and the humid weather nearly did me in for the first few months. Before the Bayou case started, I met an odd person while on my lunch break that gave me hints of how strange this new city really was. There's a fish shack near the office. It was mostly outdoor table space to eat, but I normally brought my lunch back to eat at my desk. I hated sitting outside in the sun trying to enjoy a meal. While I was walking past the seating area, I noticed something that made me pause. A boy, barely a teen, was sulking around the trash can. And I mean sulking. The fish shack was pretty much a fast food place, and people would toss away their trash outside at the end of the meal. The boy watched as a couple got up and tossed a styrofoam container away, with a few fries and a small piece of a fried fish inside. He waited until they took a few steps away, until he quickly pulled the container out. Before he could eat the scraps, I walked over to him. "Hey, don't eat that," I told him, and he was so startled he dropped the container. I didn't mean to scare him and sound so harsh. Handing him my lunch, I bent down to pick up the garbage and threw it away again. "Here, eat mine if you're hungry. You really shouldn't eat trash. You could get sick." He looked up at me as if this was the first nice thing anyone had ever done for him. I looked him over for some signs of abuse and wondered if I could get his name. Then I could look into his situation. Despite the heat, he was wearing a sweater 3 sizes too big. The deep V-neck made the shirt slip off his narrow shoulder. His hair was a sandy color and messily cut at his shoulders. Freckles spotted his nose. He wasn't dirty, and I didn't see any bruises, so that was a good sign. Necklaces of fishing line hung from his neck, and I didn't know if he picked up some trash to wear, or if this was a new fashionable trend. "Are you sure I can have this?" he asked in a small voice, looking around as if he was committing a crime. "Of course. What's your name?" "I'm Officer Anthony Turner." I flashed my badge, hoping it made him feel safe talking to me. He slowly took out a fry and ate it, debating on whether he wanted to talk to me. "Catfish," he said finally. The one word confused me. I did order fried catfish, with a side of fries, but it took me a few seconds to clue in that he didn't mean my lunch. "Is that your legal name?" I said, and he nodded. I've heard worse names since I'd arrived in the city. Maybe his father was really into fishing. Was his sibling named Crawdad or something? Smiling at my own joke, I gestured for him to sit down at the wooden table, to talk with me for a while. Catfish didn't look as if he was starving, but he must have had a good reason for trying to eat from the trash. "So, Catfish, what's up with trying to get table scraps? I don't mean to pry into your private life, but seeing something like that makes me a bit worried." He listened as he slowly started to eat, then stuffed his face full of fries, to the point he nearly choked. I gladly handed over my can of iced tea. It appeared that whoever raised this kid dropped the ball somewhere. "I've wanted to try some food from here for ages. It smells great, but I don't have any money. Oh, wait. I found a few coins here and there. They're not on me, so I don't know how much they're worth. I guess I just got desperate," he explained after drinking nearly the whole can of iced tea in one gulp. "Thank you for giving me this. It's a nice treat, and I'll pay you back one way or another." He gave me a wide smile that looked a bit too long for his face. Normally large mouths look unsettling, but his made him similar to a happy frog. Catfish was a good kid at least. It made me worry that someone may take advantage of him, and was so glad I was the one who spotted him first. I gave him a wave at the offer to pay me back for lunch. "It's fine, I don't mind buying you a meal, but can I ask if you're doing alright? Are you eating enough at home? And it's a Tuesday, isn't it? Shouldn't you be in school?" I sounded like a worried parent. These questions would be enough to scare anyone off, but he listened while eating a bit more carefully this time. The first bite of catfish made him so happy he tapped his feet on the ground, causing his flip-flops to make a slapping sound for a few seconds. After he could focus, he went into answering my questions. "I'm eating just fine. I can catch enough in the bayou to stay well fed most days. I was taking care of someone who couldn't be alone, so I couldn't go to school. I don't have any plans of moving, so I don't really need schooling. The bayou provides me with everything I need. Aside from the rare treat like this meal." He was smiling again, but I crossed my arms thinking it over. He appeared happy, and I should drop the whole thing. I felt as if he was a bit too young to be on his own. I've heard about people living in the bayou before, but I always assumed they were old hermit types. As long as he was healthy, it was none of my business, no matter how I felt about it. "Do you have a cell phone or a computer at home?" I asked, and he shook his head. "How about you meet me here every Tuesday, and I'll buy you lunch?" His face lit up. Quickly, he forced down his excitement, shaking his head feeling guilty accepting such an offer. "It's a kind offer, but it's hard for me to accept things for free," he admitted. "You can catch things in the bayou, right?" My parents made killer crawdads, but never have enough time to catch fresh ones. How about you bring a few over and we can do a trade? I wasn't even done speaking when a hand shot out for us to seal the deal. I let out a laugh and shook his small hand. Catfish now didn't hide how happy he was to try different things on the menu, without needing to dig around in the trash can. My lunch break was about up and I should have been back at the office a few minutes ago. I double-checked to make sure Catfish was really doing alright, and we made a promise to meet next week. I wanted to get his last name, but didn't push for it. Next time we spoke, I would ask. When Tuesday rolled around, I met him at the fish shack as promised. I ordered whatever he wanted to try. This time, it was a fish burger with extra everything on top. I may have been spoiling him a little. The only problem came when he upheld his end of the bargain and brought a tub of live crawdads. The tub was sealed with air holes on the lid. I heard them angrily scuttling around and didn't expect them to still be alive and out for revenge. I didn't have a plan of how to deal with them at the office, but didn't bring it up to Catfish as he happily ate his lunch. We parted ways and I took the tub back to the office. My partner, very confused as to why I gave him a bucket of live crawdads. In the middle of the workday, he lived close by so he could swing over to his place to hand them off to his wife to deal with. I didn't have the heart to tell him that more would be coming every Tuesday. For a few weeks, I spent meeting up with a boy I barely knew anything about. He refused to give me his last name, saying he'd forgotten it. I didn't pressure him into telling me anything he didn't want to. The only facts I knew about him is he lived off the land. His parents were long gone, and he was very skilled at catching crawdads. To my parents' dismay, our Tuesdays would have continued on like that if a big case didn't break. A girl went missing. Then her body was found in the bayou 2 days later. Then another poor girl. And then another. But her body wasn't recovered. Because of the case, I became too busy to meet Catfish at lunch. He fully understood and told me he was rooting for me to find the killer. I wasn't a detective and only had a very small part of the case, but still wanted to do my best to help. I only chased down leads the detective didn't have time for, or took over different office tasks to free up more manpower. The constant overtime lasted for 3 months until a huge break happened. A suspect was identified. From what I heard, he tried taking a girl on her way home from school. What he didn't know was she took mixed martial arts since she was a child. A high school student took him by surprise and kicked the hell out of him. No other way to put it. Sadly, he got back into his car and drove off, but he left behind enough blood to get a name from previous assault charges. This man was careful enough not to leave any DNA behind on the bodies, and messed up by picking the wrong victim. We didn't know for certain if it was the same guy, but felt the odds were pretty good that it was. Unfortunately, the suspect wasn't home when a few officers did a house call. A boat was registered in his name. His car parked at the docks with fresh blood left behind, but his boat nowhere to be seen. From witness statements, he'd gone into the bayou and had yet to come back to the dock. So we had an idea of who killed those girls and went into the bayou. Only 2 bodies were recovered, and each were found in popular catfishing areas. We had a murderer and 1 more body to find. I volunteered to be a part of the search party, even though I'd never been in the bayou before, and well, never been part of a search party either. I was paired up with someone who had experience in both. The department only cared about having manpower out there looking, and didn't care if I didn't know what I was doing. Before going out with the search party, I listened to some advice and bought some high rubber boots They turned out to not be tall enough, but at least they kept my feet somewhat dry. Going out into the swamp chasing down a killer was nerve-wracking. I listened to the briefing very carefully. Everyone was paired off and we double-checked our equipment. My new partner was impressed that I brought along spare batteries for the radio, but shook his head when I forgot the bug spray. We shared some after introducing ourselves to each other. "I'm Trevor Kelsey. Just stay close and watch out for gators," he said, and wasn't joking about the gators. I was extra nervous from those words, and I took my time shaking his hand, putting off going into the swamp. I finally released Kelsey's hand so I could follow him to the boat that would take us to our search area. The bug spray didn't do much. My arms itched and my clothing was damp from the humidity. The search was already miserable, and we'd barely gotten started. Keeping all my complaints silent, we walked along in the swamp, my feet sinking every step. Our team was looking for the latest missing girl. It would be nice if we could find and catch the culprit, but everyone thought he was long gone, or hiding somewhere nicer than the swamp, since the other bodies were found in fishing areas. The rest needed to be checked over. Some places could only be reached by boat, but sometimes you could walk part of the way depending on the water level. I scratched my arms, convinced bugs were biting away at me. Sweat dripped from my nose as Kelsey kept his pace slow, so his novice partner could keep up. "Sorry I'm slow," I apologized after we needed to stop because my foot was stuck. It took me a minute to get it free, to carry on. Kelsey shook his head, not looking upset for having me along. "Everyone has a first time doing something. We had odd numbers, so unless you came along, I would either be alone or sit this one out. At least you're willing to slog through all of this. I've been with guys who had 10 years of searching the Bayou under their belt, and they just complained about every trip." I let out a short laugh, feeling better that I wasn't the worst person he's been stuck with. As we walked, I kept my eyes and ears focused, trying to see any signs of human life. The Bayou was almost like an alien planet for someone like myself. The air was heavier than I've ever felt before. Chirping sounds off in the distance rattled my nerves, and every ripple of the water made me tense up, expecting a gator to come at us at any second. I didn't understand how anyone could live here. Did catfish really stay in the bayou, or was this place a small shack just on the edge of it? This place was beautiful and yet felt dangerous. Kelsey noticed how nervous I was and started up a conversation. "Scared something's going to jump out and get ya?" he asked in a joking tone. "Actually, yes," I admitted with no shame. He laughed at me, shaking his head. If a small kid like my lunch friend could live out here, it couldn't be all that dangerous, right? I really wanted that to be the case, as my foot yet again got caught. I heard a sound off in the distance. Before Kelly started speaking, my head turned away from him. I half listened, trying to find the source of the other noise. "Don't worry about it. The key thing is to stay." I was looking off into the swamp through the mossy trees when Kelly suddenly stopped talking. When I turned to ask him what was wrong, I felt my heart nearly stop. The man that was a few steps away a second ago was gone. Not even any ripples on the water. That didn't make any sense. He was right in front of me and didn't have any time to walk away. There weren't even any trees wide enough to hide behind. Wanting to believe this was a prank on the new guy, I stayed in the same spot, scanning the trees. "Kelly, this isn't funny. Can you come out so we can do our job?" I shouted off into the bayou, trying to keep my voice even. Only the sound of the swamp answered back. I felt sweat clinging to my back, but this time, not from the heat. I called his name out again, trying not to freak out. A mixture of fear and simmering rage spilled into my stomach. Grabbing my radio, I started to call in the fact that I'd lost my partner. Kelly may get an earful about this dumb prank, but he deserved it. The radio crackled, and then died. Frantically replacing the batteries gave the same result. Pulling out my phone, I felt my hand start to tremble, when it didn't even turn on. I charged it right before we left. It should be at 90% at least, and yet it was dead. Suddenly, I felt like the final person in a horror movie. Shaking my head in an attempt to collect myself, I thought of what to do next. A blur of motion in the distance caught my eyes. Something dark moved between some trees, and it looked human. "Hey, Kelly." I called out, full well knowing it couldn't be him. It was a bad idea, but I started after the figure that was now hiding behind the twisted trees. I only got a few steps when I heard a splash behind me, and I turned to see another figure dart behind a different tree. I almost missed it. This wasn't good. Whoever was messing with me, there was more than one of them. My hand went to my holster at my side. I've drawn my weapon a handful of times, and only shot at a person once before. Whatever was happening, I didn't like it in the slightest. "I'm with the police. We're on official business here, looking for a body. So please do not get in the way of our investigation," I called out, unsure of what else to say. A chattering sound came. It almost sounded like laughter. I was not going to take the friendly approach any longer. Weapon drawn, I scanned the trees looking for more of those dark figures. As that horrible sound echoed around, air caught in my lungs when the sound stopped, and I saw the cause. A massive shadow started to swim through the water in my direction. I scrambled, trying to find solid ground, which was rare in that swamp. The water was only ankle deep in spots. Something large enough to cast such a shadow should be too big to swim in such shallow water. Taking my eyes off the dark shape, I looked up, trying to see if what I was seeing was a shadow of a plane or a really weird cloud. Nothing but the treetops and clear blue sky. A splashing sound jerked my attention back down, convinced an alligator finally decided I was a tasty snack. Weapon raised, I almost fired. What I saw made me lower my handgun, and all the tension faded from my shoulders. I was surprised, but didn't think of him as a threat. "Catfish? What the hell are you doing here?" I demanded in a stressed voice. The boy I'd become friends with was coming out of the swamp, water dripping from his loose clothing. How did he sneak up on me? And why did it look like he was coming out of a much deeper part of the water when it was so shallow? "You really shouldn't be on this side. What are you doing here?" he said, tossing my question back at me. "My job. I know you live in the bayou, but..." "No, never mind. Have you seen my partner? He was just here." Looking around, I almost expected to see Kelsey again, or at least those figures off in the distance. I was so strung out, I didn't even register what Catfish first said. He was twisting the edge of his sweater, trying to get some of it dry. A friendly face was nice, even if I didn't know what was going on. "No, I hadn't seen any human besides yourself lately. I heard your voice and came over, really not expecting to see you here. I guess you're after that other man,
that came through a little while ago, dropping a dead girl off. Not sure where the girl is though. Staring at the boy, my mouth nearly dropped open. Catfish might know where the suspect was. He was a dangerous man, and I really hoped he didn't see the boy, and was coming after the only witness. And what did he mean by the only human? I knew kids his age could be a bit weird, thinking they're vampires and such, but Catfish didn't seem like the type. Some weird stuff's been going on. Please don't add to it. Did the other man see you? Do you think we're safe? He didn't see me. He's dead. The others living in the bayou got him. I suppose it's your job to get proof of his death. Let's do that and I'll guide you out of here. I do owe you after all. So much for not adding to the weirdness. Catfish was far too calm telling me about the man's death. That fact startled me more than anything else he hinted at. The boy started to walk easily through the swamp, leaving me to helplessly follow slowly after him. What do you mean by others? Who killed him? No matter how hard I tried, I was unable to catch up to the boy. He walked as if the swamp was normal ground. I kept getting stuck, and the heat wasn't helping. Catfish didn't look as if he wanted to answer my very important question. With a shrug, he nodded his head off towards the trees. You might have seen little glimpses of them. You know, others. I don't talk to them much, so I don't know what they are, he said, with another shrug. What the hell was going on? I was out here trying to find a missing girl, to bring some sort of closure to her family, so they could bury her. Now I was following behind a boy I thought I knew. He was implying there were things besides bugs and gators in the place. All of this was a prank. For my own sanity, I needed it to be one. Catfish, you've been talking about weird stuff since I saw you. What are you getting at? What did I stumble into? He stopped walking to look over his shoulder. Our eyes met and I noticed how dark and deep they appeared. For a moment, those eyes were not one of a child, but of something much older. When he turned, a smile was on his face, and the expression that made him look like a happy little frog made me relax. Whatever was going on, someone was on my side. Let's just get proof of that man's body for now. After you're in a safe spot, I'll explain things a little more. That was acceptable. If he did start explaining what was going on, I doubt I would understand it or even want to hear it. That moment, I just wanted to focus on doing my job. The weird stuff could wait. At least, I wanted the weird stuff to wait. As I struggled through the water and over spongy ground, the sky started to grow darker. That made us both nervous. It should still only be noon, and there was no rain in the forecast. The bayou was bad enough. Walking through it in the rain would be a nightmare. It felt like an hour of trudging along and sweating, until Catfish stopped. He pointed a few feet in front of him to a bundle of clothing. At first, I didn't notice those rags still had a human inside. The smell was awful. Pulling my shirt over my nose, I walked towards it, Catfish staying behind. He shouldn't see a terrible sight like this. Normally insects would make a meal out of a body out in the open like this. But none touched the corpse. The body was face down, meaning I needed to flip it over to try and confirm the man's identity. I didn't want to contaminate the scene any more than I already did. Pulling out my phone, I checked it, begging for it to turn on, so I could take a picture and document the position of the body. A miracle happened and it flickered to life. Wasting no time, I tried calling my boss, and then 911.
but nothing went through. At least I could take the photos I wanted. When I thought I got enough photos, I finally forced myself to grab a stick to roll the body over. My stomach tightened and I nearly lost my light lunch. As the corpse bobbed in the shallow water, he wasn't dead for very long, I could tell that much. Right away, I knew this was our suspect, but was unable to snap a photo of his face right off the bat. I lost my lunch when my eyes landed on his torn open and empty torso. A wild animal had gotten to him first. The water washed away most of the blood, leaving the corpse's flesh pale. In training, I'd seen bodies, but never was the first to discover one. As I was recovering, a sound came from my hip that nearly made me jump out of my skin. My radio crackled to life. It was only static, but it gave some hope of getting someone over here to help. Because I was so focused on the radio, I wasn't paying any attention to Catfish suddenly moving closer. "Come in, this is..." Only a few words left my lips, as the soggy ground from under my feet was gone. My body sank like a brick in deep, murky water. The foul-tasting water entered my mouth before I could hold my breath. Sinking down, the water became colder, and I nearly screamed when something touched my ankle. It was a hand, and at first, I assumed it was someone trying to help, until more hands came clawing through the cold darkness, grabbing any part they could. I wanted to scream. If I did, I would die. My lungs wouldn't hold for very long. A short while ago, I was with Kelsey, and my only worries was an alligator or a serial killer. Now, the Bayou reached out to take my life, and there was nothing I could do about it. My arms were pinned from the countless hands, and I couldn't even try to struggle to the surface, or grab my handgun as a blunt object to attack the cold hands. Regrets flashed through my mind. Lungs about to burst, my brain went through everything I knew, trying to find a way out of this impossible situation. Just as my time ran out, the hands let go to scatter back into the dark. Someone else took hold to save a scared novice officer from nearly dying. Coughing and sputtering out the grimy water, the ordeal left it impossible to see my savior for a few minutes. Yes, I was thankful to be alive, but confused over what the hell happened. "Turner, are you alright? What the hell, man?" Kelsey's voice cut through the panic of nearly dying. He dragged me to better ground as I coughed up the rest of the water I'd nearly swallowed. Rubbing my eyes clear, I looked over the scene. He stood looking as panicked as I felt. My gear ruined, but he was already on a working radio, calling for backup. "What?" I started, voice too hoarse to speak. "We were just walking along and you just got pulled under. Did a gator? Christ on a stick. When did that body get there?" Kelsey's attention was directed towards the dead man floating near where he saved me. Neither of us spoke until the other teams arrived, thinking it was an alligator attack and not a body retrieval. The entire recovery was impossible to explain, so we both just went with whatever questions that were asked, giving the only answers we could. My boot was missing and pants torn, so it was assumed that an alligator did grab me to pull me under. The vague answers sounded as if I was in shock over nearly losing my leg and my life. The killer was found and his last victim was also recovered by a different, more experienced search team. After his body was found, enough evidence came to light proving he was the killer, and the case was closed. His official cause of death was an animal attack. The resolution felt a little bitter. However, the man was no longer able to harm another person.
Waiting till Tuesday was agony. At first, I thought the strange events and meeting catfish in the bayou was a false memory from nearly drowning, but it felt too damn real to dismiss until I saw catfish again and asked him some questions. He was late and I didn't think he was going to show up. For a while, I worried his entire existence was false. Sitting in the hot sun, sipping on an iced tea, I waited until my lunch break was nearly up. Finally, Catfish sat down on the other side of the table, a kind smile on his face. "I guess you have questions," he started. "A few. I don't really know where to start. I guess. Are you human?" "Nope." The reply came with no hesitation. "I'm just a catfish." Now that I was looking at him more, he did have fish traits. I was kicking myself mentally for not noticing it before. His oversized sweater sleeves, looking like fins. His messy like hair poking out of both sides of his head, almost like whiskers. And his freckles, the same kind of spots a catfish's skin might have. His smile now looked more like a fish than a frog, the more I looked. He even wore fishing line and lures. How obvious could he be? "Just a catfish," I repeated, looking the boy over. "Normally humans can't see me. You have really good sight, and because you're interacting with me in my human form, others can see me as well. But your issue is your sight was too good. You accidentally got on the other side of the bayou, where I live and the other things hunt. If I didn't drag you back to your side, then you would have been taken by the same ones that killed that man. I'm not the type to really stick my nose in business like that. But you bought me food, and I did owe you." Sitting back, his answers played through my mind. It explained why Catfish didn't bring any crawdads this time. We were even. Hell, I owed him now. In a way, Catfish only gave a vague description of what happened and what he was. It was good enough for me. I didn't want to know about supernatural things happening deep in the swamp. But if I stayed at the department, I may need to go back into the bayou again. Moving and finding a new job sounded like such a hassle, when there was a better option. "If I buy you lunches, would you be able to keep me from going on the other side of the bayou if I needed to search it again for work?" I asked hopefully. Catfish made a show of humming over the idea when the smells of the fish shack drifted over on the wind. He broke down, unable to keep up the act. With a sheepish smile, he gave me a small nod. "If you make it Tuesdays and Fridays, I can make sure you don't slip up again." Reaching out my hand, we shook on it. My wallet may take a hit, but it was better than uprooting my life or dying in the swamp. Plus, Catfish was a nice kid. In the very least, he deserved a good meal twice a week. I was still adjusting to a move across the country and a new job. In the past few months, I've made a habit of buying lunch for a boy named Catfish. Before I met him, I never believed in supernatural things. But after a trip in the bayou, I was forced to see there were some things beyond natural in the world. Somehow that fact didn't shake my view on life. I carried on like normal. As long as I stayed away from those supernatural threats, I would be safe. At least, that's what I assumed. 2 days a week, I would spend my lunch break with Catfish,
who was, well, a catfish. He appeared human, but I knew he was something else. Maybe not just a fish, but something more dangerous. Because I bought him food, we became friends. He promised to protect me if I did slip up and come across something unnatural threatening my life. He was such a powerful thing in a small body. I never needed to worry about losing a fight. Again, that's what I thought. On my lunch break, I was at our usual spot. Catfish hadn't shown up yet, and I was worried about it. He never missed out on getting free food. The only time we didn't meet is if my job got in the way. As the minutes passed, I grew more anxious about him. He didn't own a cell phone, and there was no way to contact him to see if he was alright. Just as it felt as though my nerves were going to get the better of me, a man stopped beside my table. At a glance, it was obvious he knew Catfish, and he wasn't human. His hair was long and unkempt, eyes so light it looked as if they didn't have any color to them, stared me down. He was wrapped up in a blanket, torn and dirty, and bare feet stuck out from under the sheet. He gave me a cold stare, face somewhat hidden behind his hair. Oddly enough, it felt as if I've seen him before, but couldn't place his face. "Catfish is in trouble. You need to save him. Follow me." Giving me no time to respond, he turned and started away. My stomach sank. Images of that kind boy flashed through my mind as I got up, stumbling over my own feet, in a rush to follow this man. I walked into work saying a family emergency came up, and I needed the rest of the day off. Since I've yet to miss a day, my boss let me call in on short notice. I kept asking the stranger questions about Catfish and what was going on, but he didn't respond. Instead, he paused and looked me over, with a face that could freeze fire. "Do you own a car?" I nodded, and this time, he followed me. It was only a short walk back to the office, and yet each second passed impossibly slowly. When we got to my car, he sat in the passenger seat, again, not speaking much. Other than giving me directions, he refused to answer any important questions. We drove to a small dock with a rowboat at the end. He stood in the front of the boat facing away, keeping perfect balance as I swayed the small craft getting in. The moment both my feet were on the wood, the boat started to glide down the water on its own. After what happened the last time I was in the Bayou, I wasn't keen on entering it again. My stomach twisted in stress and fear. I wished the boat would go faster, so I could find my small friend and hopefully get him out of trouble. I didn't understand what I could even do. I was human and felt helpless against any supernatural threat. The boat steered through narrow waterways. The bayou around us was an amazing piece of nature, full of creatures and life I would never fully understand. It was still early in the afternoon, and yet the lights surrounding us looked golden, as if the sun was setting. I spotted Catfish before the boat reached him. It needed to steer around some wet but solid ground. The boy was on his back, covered by a dirty blanket on a soggy bank. I didn't wait for the boat. I jumped out, rushing towards him, finding it hard to move in damp ground. My shoes soaked and pants wet up to the knees. I pressed on, frantic. When I did reach him, I collapsed next to the sleeping boy, thinking the worst. Cat. What happened to him? I demanded up at the man who stopped beside us. Catfish was pale, his breathing weak and ragged. The blanket covering the frail boy, stained by what I feared to be blood. The man looked almost emotionless, not affected by my outburst. "He was attacked by a creature."
They tore out an organ for who knows what reason. He's tough, but can't hold on for more than a day or so," the man said in a low voice. He sounded angry, but it was easy to see that he was upset at himself for not protecting Catfish. Lifting the boy into my lap, I shuddered over how cold he felt. I placed a hand on his damp forehead, feeling as if I was going to burst. The reasons I moved across the country came flooding back, seeing him like this. I forced them all down to focus on what I could do. "We need to get him to a hospital." The man shook his head. If it was that simple, he could have already done it. For some reason, he brought me here. That was a hopeful sign. I would do anything to save this kind kid. "There is a creature that lives deep in the bayou. She can make something to heal him. However, she does not exchange with other supernatural things. I can bring you to her," he explained. "Put him in the boat and we'll go right now." The man shook his head at what I said. I heard a noise from Catfish and kept brushing his hair out of his face, trying to soothe him. "No, he must stay here. The place we are going is dangerous. You might not even make it. I cannot watch over him and you at the same time." I hated leaving Catfish behind while he was suffering. I understood why we needed to do so, and I didn't have anyone I could call to watch the boy for me. If I called my partner, he would rush Catfish off to a hospital right away. "Don't." A small voice came from the boy in my arms. I was glad he was strong enough to speak, but hearing his voice broke my heart. I wanted to kill whatever did this to him. Instead of looking as if he was in pain, the boy smiled up at me. It wasn't his usual wide smile, and that made my chest tighten. "Turner, it's fine. Don't risk your life for me." "It's not fine. There's no way we're leaving you to die like this." He looked up with a strained expression. He knew I wasn't going to back down, and the last thing he wanted was a friend to get hurt for his sake. The thought of someone dying for him may hurt him more than having an organ ripped out. "I'll protect him. I'm strong enough for that now. I don't need to rely on your strength, so this man shall not die on your behalf." The man stood confident in our mission. Catfish did not appear to share the same thoughts. He closed his eyes and let out a sigh, knowing he couldn't stop us. "Please, just come back alive, no matter what." I promised him we would. Speaking drained Catfish of his strength, and he fell asleep again. I gave him a few moments to rest before lifting him to place the boy under a tree, hoping it was a better spot instead of his legs being in the water. The man silently watched as I promised Catfish again. I would save him and placed a kiss on top of his head. I was facing an entire bayou of supernatural creatures far beyond my power and understanding. I barely knew anything about this area because I'd recently moved from a colder part of the country. This trip would truly be venturing into the unknown. I turned to face the mystery man, ready to press forward and not wanting to waste any more time. He gave me a nod and led me back to the boat. I could do nothing but sit as we started to go further and deeper into the bayou and into a swamp. As we drifted along, it got darker and darker. The man took a thick stick from the bottom of the boat and wrapped some fabric around the end to make a torch. After he lit it, he stood at the front of the boat again, the fire lighting our way. Due to the darkness, it was impossible to see past the firelight. I heard things chattering off in the dark and splashes of water around us. My handgun at my hip, I felt jumpy, ready to draw it. A gun might not be much against the monsters in this place, but it was better than nothing. Finally, the boat hit land, and we got off onto the damp ground.
My feet sank every step. Hyper aware of everything around me, I followed the stranger, being guided by the faint light. The man hadn't introduced himself, and the feeling of seeing him before never faded. It was either solving that mystery or letting the fear of the dark take over. "Have we met before?" I asked in a low voice. "No." He didn't even take his attention off the path. I knew his face, but not his voice. A twig snapped and I couldn't see what caused it. Because my guide didn't seem worried, I didn't stop walking. My palms felt sweaty from stress. I just wanted to hurry and save Catfish, but we remained at a slow walking speed. "You have a gun, correct? Do not use it unless needed. It will not kill anything here. Just piss them off," he warned, then gave me a quick glance over his shoulder. "Do you work at the police station we took your car from?" That was a bit of an off-topic question. I nodded. He didn't elaborate on why he asked. Suddenly, I remembered why I knew this man when I thought of his face in the station. Every day I walked by his photo on the way to my desk, along with the photos of other fallen officers from that station. "You're Troy Gavin. What on earth are you doing in the swamp?" I blurted out. His pace stopped for a moment at my words before carrying on. At some point, this man was human and worked as a detective 2 years before I got the job. I heard some about his past, and it was slowly coming back in bits and pieces. He disappeared and was presumed dead. But there was a reason for that I was forgetting. "It's a long story," he started. "I have nothing else to do. I don't mean to pry if you don't want to tell me though," I commented with a shrug. Another glance as he decided to answer my questions. It was a sign that we were in a safer part of the bayou, if he was fine speaking so casually. "I worked as a detective in the same station you're at. Some little girls were being kidnapped and murdered. I was able to track down the murderer, but the problem was he was a priest. A combination of a good lawyer and his flock giving him a false alibi got him off the murders." We walked, Gavin's voice low in the oppressing darkness around us. The torch flickered and I started to feel a terrible pit of ice forming in my stomach. Details of the case I heard about came back to my memory, and I regretted asking Gavin about it. I knew what that priest did when he got off free. Gavin continued on regardless. "When he got out, he killed my 10-year-old sister. I felt cold and needed to stop walking." Gavin also stopped halfway turned in my direction. His face had a hard expression on it. I never should have asked. I shook my head trying to clear it. "I'm so sorry. I bet that lawyer and the people who vouched for him couldn't forgive themselves for helping a monster like that." For a moment, Gavin almost looked amused in the firelight. Something reflected off his finger, and for the first time I noticed a wedding band. He gave up a married, normal human life and turned into something else. I knew the priest was dead, but didn't hear the details on how that happened. New cops normally didn't get the lowdown on all the older cases, unless they were really interesting or relevant. "The lawyer quit. The ones who gave the false alibi had their lives ruined in some way or another. I could arrest the priest for my sister's murder, but I wanted everyone to suffer. I wanted that lawyer to lose everything. I wanted to torment him in the most painful way possible. In the end, I did so. I found the 3 words to say that would utterly ruin him, swallowing the lump that formed in my throat. I almost didn't want the answer I asked for. A girl died, but that man was just doing his job. If he quit after, he might not have known that the priest was guilty, and just did what he was hired for. I didn't know how I felt about Gavin taking revenge on the man. "What did you say to him?" I asked in a strained voice. "I love you." My heart skipped a beat and my eyes went back to the wedding band. This man did the cruelest thing he could think of. By marrying the lawyer who felt responsible for his little sister's murder, instead of harassing him or physically assaulting the other man, he drove in emotional pain every time he looked at his new husband. I couldn't imagine being so heartless to do such a thing. When I didn't respond, Gavin turned to carry on. "I belong here. I was already a monster before Catfish showed me how to turn into one." His voice was low as we started walking again. I thought I heard some soft sounds under his voice, but replied before I started to try and find the source. "Did you come here because you feel guilty for what you did?" I asked, unable to keep the question unspoken. Suddenly, sound erupted from behind. It was something that didn't belong in a bayou. It was so foreign and unnerving. I couldn't help myself from turning around and trying to find out what was making it. It was clapping. Not scattered clapping, but rhythmic clapping. As if hundreds of people were all clapping at once in a beat only they knew. "Don't look at them," Gavin warned, but it was too late. When I looked, the darkness came away all at once. The bayou looked like it was at dusk, with enough light to see by. My eyes adjusted as I saw countless figures crowding between the mossy trees. They clapped but stopped the second my eyes landed on them. All stood frozen in time, hands raised similar to a prayer. Each and every one of these people were dead. Glossy blank eyes stared as the smell hit. Rotted flesh peeled away from bones, and clothing hung off their thin frames. My mouth opened to scream, but no noise came out, as all at once they rushed forward. A hand wrapped around my eyes, and Gavin grabbed around my shoulder from behind to draw me close. I felt the air rush past as those figures ran by, the clapping starting up again. As suddenly as it happened, it stopped. Gavin lowered his hands and went back to the still lit torch he dropped. I was still trembling and breathing hard, not understanding what I just saw. The light faded back to a darkness that made it impossible to see if there was more of the dead looking at us. "What?" I croaked out, unable to walk. Gavin took my arm and dragged my shaking body forward until I could take some steps on my own. He wasn't afraid in the slightest. That fact made dread spread throughout my entire body. I'd just witnessed the most frightening thing in my entire life, and it didn't even faze him. "That was just a tide. Don't worry about it. Unless you pay attention to them, you won't get swept up in it," he explained. "That a tide? This place, can I ever understand anything about it?" I asked. He paused and shook his head. He could tell me everything about this side of the bayou, where he and Catfish lived, but I was human. I would never understand what creatures roamed and the reason for their existence. If I was lucky, that army of the dead would be the only thing we would come across. Unfortunately, I wasn't. I just bought a new house, new to us at least. The house is 50 years old, and comes with all the wonderful trappings of an older home. Scribbled walls, dirty closets, a leaky roof, and even a family of mice. The thing that annoys me the most though, is the growth chart of the previous residents' children.
On the wall of the master bedroom closet are successive tick marks in pen, not pencil, because they were horrible people who had no respect for their dwelling. Each one was named and dated. Frank, October of '83. Julia, May of '85. Still staring at that, huh? My husband asked when he came into the bedroom and found me scowling into the closet. Yup. He joined me and examined the wall. Huh, I thought the previous owner only had 2 kids. Yeah, she did. So? Why are there 3 names? What do you mean? Jay walked over and pointed to a tick mark. It was one of the shortest ones, only a few feet off the ground, marked not with Frank or Julia, but the name Sam. I scanned the rest of the marks, and there was no other mark for Sam, just the one. Huh, that's weird. Then my heart sank. Maybe they had a child that died young. Oh no, it's probably not that. Probably a friend just wanted to be measured or something. Yeah, I already felt bad for the previous owner. She was an older lady, or so we heard, and this house had been in foreclosure when we bought it. Had she lost a child in addition to a home? What a horrible thing to happen. Over the coming days, the tick marks weighed on my mind, not only because of the tragedy. Jay and I were in the midst of trying to conceive our first child, and the tick marks felt like a cruel mockery of how long it was taking. And so, every time I opened the closet to get dressed, my eyes shot down to that one tick mark, Sam. Sometimes I'd be depressed about not being pregnant, but other times a horrible image would flash through my mind. A faceless child choking on a snack, drowning in a pool, getting hit by a car. Can we paint the closet? I asked. Jay looked up from the TV. I guess. But you know, it'd be better if we did it in a few months, when I'm off for... Please, it's really bothering me. He sighed. Okay, sure. So we picked up the paint, a beautiful neutral color, somewhere between beige, gray, and white. On Saturday morning after breakfast, I went back to the bedroom and began emptying the closet. I muttered to myself, I have a lot of clothes. In fact, my clothes overflow onto Jay's designated rack, which he's not happy about. I started with my work clothes, they were the closest to the door. Lay the blouses flat on the floor, folded the skirts neatly in half. I was halfway through my rack when I saw it. A little bit of red cloth poking out from all the business grays and whites of my wardrobe. My eyebrows furrowed. I didn't remember owning any clothes in red. The color always clashed slightly with my auburn hair. I pushed apart the hangers. What? On the rack hung a kid's outfit. A red shirt and denim overalls. It looked old, but not old in a worn way. Not torn and stained with stitching coming loose. No. It was crisp and clean. But the denim was faded, and the style of shirt looked dated. There was no tag, but it looked like it probably fit a 2 or 3-year-old. Jay? I asked. He turned from his clothes, an old t-shirt hooked on his arm. What? What's this? Huh? I have no idea. Maybe the owners left it here. I'm pretty sure the closet was empty when we moved in. Maybe we missed it. I think we would have noticed it. Okay, well, either way, I'll go throw it out. I stood there alone, the unease building in my chest. I would have noticed if there was some random kid's outfit left over in the closet. Not to mention it was hanging right in the middle of my clothes. But I tried to forget about it. We spent the rest of the afternoon emptying the closet. Then we got to work with the paint. It took all weekend to finish, but at the end, the closet looked more beautiful than ever before. I waited a few days to put my clothes back. I didn't want them all to smell like paint. It was Tuesday that I began, with clothes on my arm and my heart full. I swung the door open, and I froze. There, at the end of the closet, where the tick marks used to be, one remained. Sam, October of '79. The others were completely gone, painted over. But that one remained, as if it had bled right through the coats of paint. "Jay!" I shouted. He was there in seconds. I threw my arms around him, clung to him tightly. I didn't even realize I was crying until I heard the voice above me. "Are you okay, Carrie?" "The mark's still there," I managed. "I guess I missed a spot. I'm sorry. I'll touch it up right now." I don't know why I'm crying. I don't know why it bothers me so much." "I do." He pulled me tighter. "In 2 months, we hit the year mark. And that means we should see a doctor, you know? If there's a reason." He was right, but I'd forgotten all about that. The months had all blurred together, and I hadn't kept very good track. "You're right," I sniffed and wiped at my eyes. "I'm going to paint over it right now, okay?" His arms withdrew. I listened to his footsteps recede, then thumped down the stairs. The slam of the garage door. I stood there at the closet door, watched him pour the paint in the bin, dip the roller in, and roll it neatly over Sam's growth mark. The streak of wet paint glistened in the closet light, and just like that, the mark was gone. We moved back into the master bedroom the next day. I spent most of the evening hanging my clothes back up and pushing the bins of assorted junk back inside. All the marks were gone now, and my anxiety slipped away. "Are you feeling any better?" Jay asked, as I sat down on the bed. "Yeah." He reached over and squeezed my hand. "As soon as we have enough money, we should take a vacation. Maybe to Hawaii. You've always wanted to see Hawaii, right?" I snuggled against his shoulder. "That would be awesome. I wanted to get one of those lava rocks." "You mean like pumice or obsidian?" He shrugged. "You need to study up on rocks." "Hey, I got you a good diamond, didn't I?" I wrapped my arms around him, breathing in the clean smell of his shirt. "Yeah, you did." We fell asleep early, around 10 p.m. I was feeling better about everything, and the worry slipped easily from my mind. Then I woke up to a strange sound. I glanced at the nightstand, 3:12 a.m. according to the nightstand clock. I sighed and slowly withdrew my hands from around Jay. Then I rolled over. What? The door to the closet was open. Just a few inches, but it was open, and I could see the slice of pitch black among the shadows across the bedroom. Didn't we close it? I pushed myself up on the pillows, squinting into the darkness. Something about it didn't feel right at all. I slowly got out of bed, walked across the room, the carpet soft under my feet. I reached for the light switch, then yanked the door open. My heart dropped. All over the walls, the name Sam, scrawled across the fresh paint in frenzied strokes of pen. Sam, 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 stretching up to the ceiling, down to the floor. I slammed the door shut, leapt back from the closet, and began to scream. Then Jay's arms were around me, holding me, hugging me, bringing me back to bed. "We need to call the police. Someone's been in here. Just calm down."
Calm down, someone broke in and wrote all over our wall. Jay squeezed my hand. I'm going to get you a cup of water, okay? What? You think I'm making it up? Go look in there for yourself. He didn't reply. He just got up from bed, giving me a sad smile, and started for the stairs. His footsteps faded away, but I couldn't move. What? He thinks I'm going crazy? I'll show him that I'm not. I stood up from the bed and started to the closet, but I only got halfway when the fear set in. Had I imagined seeing Sam written all over the walls? I only saw it for an instant. I could have been half asleep when I walked to the closet, and the writing was just a projection of my dream. I had to know. I forced myself the rest of the way and pulled the door open. No, the writing was still there. Sam, 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 written everywhere as if in a frenzied craze. I opened my mouth, but no sound came out. All I could do was stand there, staring, paralyzed. And then, it happened. In the corner of my eye, I saw the clothing move. The row of dark blazers on the right. Just a soft rustle a few feet off the ground. Like a child was moving through them. I grabbed the closet door, slammed it shut, retreated to the bed, shaking terrified. Jay? I finally screamed. Footsteps on the stairs, he burst back in, holding a cup of water. The liquid sloshing in the glass. What happened? There's someone. I saw the clothes move. Oh God. I swear I saw a child in there. Okay. Jay walked towards the closet, clearly not believing me. I gripped the covers, too scared to move. He swung the door open, half closing it behind him. Holy hell. Jay's voice slightly muffled. You're right. There's writing everywhere. Get out of there, I shrieked, reaching for the phone. I swear to you, I saw someone in there. There's no one in here. I'm searching through all the clothes, it's... His voice abruptly cut off. Jay? Silence. Jay? I pulled myself out of bed, my heart pounding in my chest. I started for the closet. The golden light spilled out of the opening, out onto the carpeted floor. I stood in front of it, just a few feet from the opening. Jay, I whispered, not silence this time. A soft giggle, a child's giggle. I pulled the door open. Jay stood in the middle of the room, absolutely still, his face frozen in a horrible expression of fear. And down on the floor, oh my God, the sight of it brought bile into my throat. Not a ghost kid, not a dead body, a woman. She sat on the floor nestled among our clothes, ragged gray hair tangled around her face, a wild look in her eyes, a pen in her hand. She opened her mouth, but instead of words, instead of speaking to us, she just let out a high-pitched giggle, attempting to sound like a kid. Then she snapped around to us, and staring at us with wild blue eyes, she whispered, "This is his home, and you have taken it." The heat never even woke me up. I lay there as the sun's rays crept through the window and slowly poured themselves over me. When I eventually woke up, I knew right away I was late for class. You just get this feeling in your gut when something is wrong, don't you? My wife was the one who'd always set the alarms for the morning.
It slips my mind before bed every now and again, now that I'm sleeping alone. When I'm late, it means that my daughters are late too, because I'm their alarm clock. I've asked them countless times to set their own alarms, but they just don't listen. When the system fails at my end, it fails at theirs too. I shake them, hollering and hooting until they're up and ready to go. Scowls appear on their little faces when I tell them there's no time for breakfast. Just get in the car and they can get something quick at morning interval. I kiss them, Abby the eldest on the forehead, and Lucy the youngest on the cheek, when I drop them off at their school. Abby's face contorts in faux horror as she rubs at the impact zone, while Lucy smiles a bright "I love you, Daddy" at me. I then drive a few miles to my school, find a space to park, and hurry through the front door. I'm almost running when I pass John. He gives me a disappointing shake of the head, then looks at his watch to confirm my lateness. The 4th time this month. His sympathy for my situation has limits, and I'm certainly pushing them. Then, the morning rush was finally over, and I stood in front of 30 pairs of expectant eyes, with a hangover like a dead man's switch, threatening to explode if I let it. "Good morning, class." "Good morning, Mr. Smith," in unison. I dread Mondays the most, because it's feedback day, and I need to look her in the eye and ask her about another disturbing story. Their creative writing assignments are due on Fridays. That's when she'll place it meekly on my desk. I shudder a little when I see that neat, looping handwriting of hers. It's the only class I dread the entire week, and it's just my luck that it falls first thing on a Monday. These kids are 12 and 13. Most of the stories are just terrible rip-offs of whatever the latest movie is, or simile-ridden adjective fests. Sophie's were always the same though. I'd ask her to try writing in other styles. She'd always smile and say she would, and then I'd get the next chapter of her story on that Friday. Cordelia and Ophelia are 2 princesses who live in a decrepit castle in a far-off land. They spend their days stealing fruits and meats from their town's marketplace, despite being the daughters of the king. In the first story I read about the princesses' daring exploits, they had been caught trying to steal from the mean old fishmonger, but he'd let them go in a panic after he realized that they were the daughters of the king. I gave Sophie an A on it. It was refreshing to read something with a little imagination for once. The next Friday, however, the story took a darker turn. I was introduced to the Obsidian Man. The Obsidian Man is never described in detail. He's just this presence in her stories that only Cordelia can see. Sophie would interject him into scenes without much thought, like the story where Cordelia had to find medicine in the town for Ophelia. The Obsidian Man is standing by Ophelia's bed when Cordelia leaves and then sees him in the forest. "Who is this character?" I asked her. She just shrugged as if she hadn't thought about it much. "What does he do? I mean, surely you didn't just put a character like him in without a point." "He's just always there, I don't know." I received another 3 or 4 stories like this. Cordelia and Ophelia would be off on an adventure while the king was away. The Obsidian Man would always be close by and not really interfering. Then I received a story titled, "The Obsidian Man Steps Forward." The Obsidian Man starts whispering to Princess Cordelia in the night. She tries to ignore him at first, but describes how she can't sleep with his voice in her head. A voice that's so low in tone that she felt it in her stomach. "I don't want to listen, but I have to. It must belong to God."
Cordelia says. That's when I started noticing Sophie's paling face and darkening eyes. She wouldn't say much in class, and when she did, she'd usually burst into fits of tears. Her hair grew unkempt, and her uniform untidier as the days went by. Eventually, I had to say something, so I told John, who in turn contacted her father. John and I sat down with the guy one Friday afternoon in my classroom, after he'd agreed to meet us. I told him of my concerns, that Sophie may be writing these stories to express some troubles that she was suffering. Mr. Sterling told us that Sophie and her little sister had become more and more reclusive since his wife and him had split. He told us that he'd been worried himself, but with 2 kids and 2 jobs, he hadn't had much time to talk to her about it. John suggested that Mr. Sterling was the king, Sophie was Cordelia, her little sister Ophelia, and the Obsidian Man was a metaphor for the parents' divorce, a looming presence that Sophie couldn't stop thinking about. He told me to try and encourage Sophie to keep writing about it, that it could be a form of meditation for her. Mr. Sterling seemed happy enough with that, but I wasn't convinced. I think the parallels between Mr. Sterling's situation and my own worried me the most. He was just a guy trying to do the best for his family. It's just unsettling, Mr. Sterling. She refuses to write anything but these stories, I said, passing him copies. Sophie would never steal. He almost shouted when I pointed out the stories where the Obsidian Man had convinced her to go to the marketplace and take whatever she wanted. The stories got darker and darker as the weeks went on, and I started to notice a reoccurring theme in the stories. The king was never around. He'd always be off fighting these battles or getting drunk at these grand feasts. The Obsidian Man would make Cordelia do awful things to her little sister Ophelia. He'd whisper in her ear until she just had to obey him, to make him stop. Then she'd force Ophelia to drink soured milk until she was sick. She'd prod her legs with tacks and hold her head under bath water until she came up sputtering and crying. Cordelia wanted to stop, but she couldn't. It was as if the Obsidian Man was her puppeteer. The king never suspected a thing. The story would always end with the Obsidian Man asking Cordelia to make him a gift, to show her love to him. She'd make jewelry from old bottles and paper, while he watched on from behind, his dark presence always felt and never seen. I became gravely concerned for Sophia's little sister Monica. She was in the year below her, but was never in my English class. I informed John of these new developments, and to make sure that there was not any truth to them, John contacted the king, who told us that he hadn't noticed anything going on between his girls, which didn't surprise me. Reading Sophie's stories were gut-wrenching for me. I'd sit down on a Friday night with a stack of stories, and find myself holding my breath as I read over hers, waiting for the horror. The Obsidian Man became ever present in my life too. One Friday in October last year, I received Sophie's last story, The Obsidian Man Steps Back. When I read the title, I got a little excited that it may be the story of how Sophie finally overcame her fears. How wrong I was. Cordelia had started to sneak jugs of oil, which she'd stolen from the townspeople, into the castle at the Obsidian Man's request. The king hadn't noticed because he was preoccupied with an ongoing war. She had hidden the jugs in the dungeons below the castle, and one day, when the king went out on a raiding party, the Obsidian Man told her to douse the castle in it. Pour extra in Ophelia's room, around the door and the window too. We must cleanse this place. You are such a good girl.
Sophie wrote of the Obsidian Man's metallic voice. The story ends with Cordelia standing outside the castle with a flame torch in her hand. There's a line of flammable oil leading to the castle, just begging to be lit. The Obsidian Man put a hand on her shoulder. It's icy cold and grips tightly. It's the first time he's touched her. She feels terrified but inexplicably reassured that she's doing the right thing. He leans in to whisper. She feels the cold breath on her neck. I drop the paper onto the floor. I couldn't read any further. I phoned John to tell him what I'd read, and he told me we'd have a chat with Sophie first thing Monday morning. After I hung up, I poured myself a big, satisfying whiskey. I really needed a drink after one of Sophie's stories. The next morning, I woke up in the same chair in my living room, the buzzing of my phone rising me from the stupor. John spoke worriedly on the other end. He said that people in town center had complained that their cars had been siphoned of petrol during the night. Some people claiming to have seen a young girl with canisters. The police had summoned the principals of all the local schools to try and identify the girl on their tapes. I just knew it was Sophie. "They're blurry as hell," he whispered to me. "I think you should get down here." I don't know if it was my empathy for Mr. Sterling or my concern for Sophie, but instead of going to the police station, I headed over to their house. Mr. Sterling answered the door, and I explained the situation to him. He denied Sophie had anything to do with it at first, but eventually, he admitted that he was working night shift the previous night and couldn't account for her. That's when she appeared in the doorway, the look of horror on her face, sufficient for a young girl who'd walked into her living room on a Saturday morning, only to see her English teacher sitting there. I asked her about the cars and she denied it. Softly at first, but the harder I pressed, she became more and more aggressive. "You're not in trouble, sweetheart. We just want to help." "I'm trying. I don't know. Her head snapped up towards me. "Go home. Leave. Go home," she screamed, her eyes rolling back into her skull as her voice contorted. The girl began pounding the wall with her fists, her legs flailing and her teeth gnawing. Mr. Sterling pounced to his feet quickly and grabbed his little girl as she had what looked like a seizure on the floor. "He's here. He's in the room. I can hear him whispering. Don't listen to him, Cordelia." "Quick, hand me that syringe." He barked at me firmly but calmly. I complied and watched as he injected Sophie's arm with a clear-looking medicine. The ease with which he'd done it made me think that this kind of thing was a regular occurrence in that house. Sophie's mouth began to foam as she shook violently one last time, before her muscles finally relaxed. My heart wrenched as she came to and began sobbing in her father's arms. He gripped her tightly with a stoic look welded onto his face. "I think you should leave now," he said to me. "But what the hell was that?" "Please, leave us alone." I could feel my hands shaking as I walked home. I hadn't been prepared for that. My feet seemed to respond by directing me to my local corner shop, where a bottle of Calm Me Down juice was calling my name. "You okay, Mr. Smith?" Andy said from behind the counter as I walked through the door. My face must have been visibly white. Yeah," I mumbled as I took my wallet out of my pocket. I pulled a couple of packets of M&Ms silently from the shelf and tossed them on the counter as Andy placed my usual bottle in front of me. "Look," he said, leaning in closer. "I wasn't going to say anything, but is everything okay with you?" "What do you mean?" I asked, puzzled. He poked his head forward to make sure no one else was in the store. "I caught Abby shoplifting here last week.
Now I know we go way back, but you know. My Abby? Yeah, she sneaked packets of fish fingers in her backpack when she thought I couldn't see. Most kids try lifting sweets or booze, you know? I'm not taking it any further. Just thought you should know. The fishmonger grabbed poor Cordelia by her long coat. She yelped in pain as she turned towards the angry man. He released her as soon as he recognized the princess's face. His heart sank as he realized he'd just violently grabbed the king's eldest daughter. Sophie had written, "I've never ran as fast as I did getting home. I doubt I'll run faster ever again." By the time I reached the house, flames reached out from every window, the roof collapsing in as I stood there numb. Plumes of smoke and fiery blasts erupted from the windows of Lucy's room. The fire seemingly fiercer there. I could smell that awful burning. Abby was sat in the back garden, kicking her feet and humming as she made daisy chains. A line of scorched grass led from her to the back door. She didn't seem to notice the blaze as she tied knots in the flowers. I sat down beside her and watched on helplessly as the roof came down upon my world. I felt the heat from the inferno on my face and wondered if it was all a dream or if the heat would wake me up. Abby sat up after she finished making her chains. She tied one around her wrist and held the other in her right hand. "Is that for me?" I asked from behind a numbed throat, pointing to her hand. "No," she said. My name is Michael Gallo, and I'm a private investigator. You are most likely thinking one or two things about me upon learning of my profession. Some of you probably picture a charming but jaded gumshoe, with a fascination for finding the truth, a la J.J. Gitz from the film Chinatown. Others probably picture a grimy drunkard that preys on the victims of tragedy, promising them closure that may not even exist, to find my lifelong bender. The truth is much less glamorous. I'm a failed police detective. After making one too many blunders, I opted to resign before my supervisor had the chance to fire, transfer, or demote me. The skill set I developed as a detective translated well into PI work, so I joined a local firm in my hometown. The job really is a lot duller than most people realize. A lot of the times I worked with my county's DA's office on their less important cases, gathering up information on low-level criminals. Other times I was a glorified background checker for local business owners. It was mundane as hell, really, but it always paid well enough to keep me in my decent apartment. So I never felt the need to quit. Not until recently, at least. 2 weeks ago, I decided it was time to retire a lot earlier than I had originally planned. It's been hard to find the words to explain my retirement, and I've found myself questioning my own sanity because of what I've uncovered in my final case. I figured writing my story as I remembered it might be therapeutic. So now I'm here. A month ago, a woman of about 40 years named Marjorie Holden came into my office asking me to investigate a possible disappearance. Miss Holden told me that her nephew Aaron had been out of touch for over 5 years, and that she was worried that he was in trouble. I told her to go to the police, but she figured they wouldn't take her claim seriously, since she hadn't reported the possible disappearance until now. Turns out Miss Holden was a member of a locally famous family. The Snells were well known in northeast Pennsylvania for their wealth as well as their dysfunction.
They owned one of the most lucrative local businesses in the form of the Snell Foundry, a manufacturer of airplane parts that had originally become an industry powerhouse during World War II. Jackson Snell, Marjorie's grandfather, was the man who secured the contract with the US government. He died under mysterious circumstances immediately after the war ended. The death of Jackson Snell seems to have put a lasting strain on the family, and their dysfunction has persisted into the modern era. Back to the case, Marjorie told me that Aaron had left over 10 years ago to go to college in Maryland, and he simply never returned. She believed that Aaron might have used his father's willingness to pay for his studies as an excuse to escape his family for good, and that Aaron's now deceased father simply didn't care enough to look into what his son has been doing before he died unexpectedly. Marjorie stated that she had some contact with Aaron after the death of his father, but that she hadn't heard back from him in about 5 years. She seemed to notice my reluctance to accept her case, so she offered to pay me double what I usually received if I made her case my top priority. I agreed reluctantly. I found quickly that there wasn't much about Aaron to be found on the surface. 3 friends of Aaron's from high school that Marjorie had been able to identify told me he had gone off the grid once he left town. Marjorie provided me with his Facebook page, but that clearly hadn't been used in about 8 years. I called the university he attended only to find out he had been kicked out for academic violations and personal conduct issues 3 months into his second semester. To the untrained eye, the search for Aaron was foobar. However, I was able to discover that the email he used to set up his Facebook account was also linked to a YouTube account. It seemed that Aaron had developed a fascination with urban exploration, and that he made a hobby out of videotaping his experiences, investigating abandoned buildings, and posting those videos online. His last YouTube video had been posted in February of 2011. I watched the last few videos Aaron posted on his channel, and found something important in his next to last video. To celebrate hitting 2,000 subscribers, I'm going to explore a place with some personal history. My dad owned a warehouse when I was a kid, but he died a few years ago and his business died with him. Thanks to him, there's an abandoned warehouse with my name on it, literally and figuratively. I called Marjorie and asked her if she had been to the Snell Foundry recently, to which she replied no. The building itself had been condemned after her brother's death, and had left the building to rot where it stood in a wooded area a few miles outside of Scranton. She gave me a key to the warehouse to go investigate for any signs of Aaron. Upon entry, I found a video camera lying on the floor of the warehouse, which I took with me. I also noticed a message sprawled in spray paint on the window of the foreman's office. "They are watching." Creepy. I called out for Aaron after walking through the warehouse for a second time, then decided to leave to examine the contents of the video camera. There were a few video recordings still on the SD card, most of which were uneventful. However, they were all videos of Aaron. He had in fact been there at some point. The final 7 recordings on the SD card were that of his return trip to his hometown. In the first recording, he said that since he didn't have a car, he would have to take a bus to Scranton and then hitchhike to the Snell Foundry building. The next recording saw him outside the Snell Foundry building just before nightfall. He remarked that he was worried because it was cold and getting colder, and he had no desire to walk through the woods to get back to civilization this late into the night. He debated leaving and returning the next morning, but instead he pulled out a flashlight and a crowbar from his backpack and made his way into the warehouse through one of the bay doors to make his way inside. The next 3 recordings were entirely uneventful. He told some anecdotes from his childhood, and was very obviously disappointed to find little of interest inside the building. He started his 5th recording by examining the cryptic message that was sprawled on the window of the foreman's office. He was silent while examining the message, almost like he was unfazed by it. His breathing picked up a little, and he made a comment that it wasn't the creepiest thing he's ever seen in an abandoned building. I expected him to elaborate further, but instead the video just abruptly ended. It was a little perplexing, but I figured there wasn't much to it. Maybe the camera's battery died, or maybe he bumped the button. That's why the beginning of the 6th recording shocked me a little. It was a video of Aaron breathing heavily inside what seemed like a shoddy bathroom. He put his flashlight down on the sink facing towards him, and then turned the camera towards himself. He was unsurprisingly visibly distraught, and he spoke in a frightened whisper. I saw something like a mannequin. It wasn't there when I got to the office. I know it for a fact. It was literally 10 feet away from me, and looking right at me. I had questions. Why would there ever be a mannequin in a warehouse that manufactured planes? Plus, it sounded like it should have been right in plain sight when Aaron approached the office. Why hadn't he noticed it on the video? Why hadn't I seen it when I'd been there? Did the same person that put it there for Aaron remove it after Aaron had been there? I went back to the video of Aaron approaching the foreman's office, and I didn't see anything relating to a mannequin at any point. I was horrified, just like Aaron was in the video. I really didn't want to watch the last recording on the SD card, but I had to. I was being paid to find out what happened to this kid, and it seemed like the answer may have lied on this SD card. I very reluctantly clicked on the last entry and watched it. The video showed Aaron walking silently back towards the foreman's office. I realized that he had taken shelter in the bathroom of the truck bay. From there, the only way he could have got back to the bay door from which he entered was by passing through the area where he spotted whatever it was. He was completely silent since leaving the bathroom. He turned off his flashlight as he approached a corner and whispered into the camera. This was where I saw it. He hesitated, but finally turned the light back on and found nothing where the figure had once been standing. He sighed with a mix of relief and fear. He was probably wondering what I was wondering. Where had it gone and how did it move? Something was wrong. He very slowly inched towards the office, knowing he had to pass through that area to reach safety. It was entirely dark in the warehouse except for his flashlight now. Night had fully fallen by this point, and what little natural light had previously illuminated the warehouse via the skylights in the ceiling was completely gone. Aaron crept forward towards the office, and the warehouse around him was entirely silent. Aaron gasped and froze where he stood. I couldn't immediately discern why he did this, but it became clear to me very quickly that a figure was slowly passing by him from directly behind him. The figure was so close to him that it seemed like he and Aaron brushed shoulders. The figure walked into the light coming from Aaron's flashlight, but didn't acknowledge the petrified Aaron's presence. Obviously, this person should have noticed Aaron, considering Aaron was providing the only discernible light source in that part of the building, and was breathing very heavily. But he didn't acknowledge Aaron. It was difficult for me to get a clear view of this figure, as the camera was jumping in and out of focus. But from what I could tell, he was just a normal person. He seemed to be wearing overalls, but I honestly can't be sure. Aaron turned his flashlight off once the figure moved to its right into the foreman's office. Once the light was turned off,
I thought the video ended. It was entirely silent for about 40 seconds. I was startled when Aaron began whimpering quietly after his long period of silence. I'm not fully sure what happened in the darkness, but from what I could gather, he had moved forward in hopes of reaching the exit, and wound up at the door of the foreman's office where the figure had just entered. Aaron's sobbing got slightly louder, but then immediately stopped when a rustling emanated from his right. There was a brief silence that seemed to last eternities, before it was finally broken again. "Hi, Aaron." The voice was quiet but shrill, almost like that of a small child. Aaron immediately screamed and dropped the camera. It seemed as if whomever or whatever was in the office had lunged at him, because seconds after Aaron's scream, I heard a piercing screech and the sound of heavy footsteps banging rapidly against the concrete floor of the warehouse. Other than the sound of Aaron's distant pained screams, scattered throughout the next 15 minutes of the video was dark and silent for 29 minutes after Aaron dropped the camera. Then, the video just ended once the SD card ran out of space. Unfortunately, I have no answers for you. I immediately gave the SD card to the police, since this is clearly something much more malicious than just a young man being estranged from his family. I gave the police a statement and gave them the contact information for Miss Holden, and then I asked them not to contact me in regards to this case, unless it was entirely necessary. Thankfully, I haven't heard from them since. I'm obviously shaken to the core by all of this. I rarely sleep anymore. Like I said earlier, I am now retired, but have absolutely no source of income. I can't collect a severance check since I quit my job, but I also find it increasingly difficult to go out into the world to look for a new job. I'm hoping that writing this post will alleviate my mind of the suffering I have experienced since finding what happened to Aaron Snell. If not, I'm honestly not sure I can last much longer. In the days since watching the video, I have had my gun constantly on my person, in case whatever it was that came for Aaron came for me next. My constant fear has persisted, and I've reached the point where I've decided that if tonight proves to be either a sleepless night or another night plagued by nightmares of the thing from the video, I will turn the pistol on myself to spare myself from a fate worse than death that seems to be awaiting us all. I've been single my entire life. I really don't mind it. It's just how I've always been. And yet, I still buy Valentine's candy and cards every year. That simple thing saves my life. I moved to a small town right before starting high school. It was difficult trying to make new friends and adjusting to an entirely new place at the same time. By the time February rolled around, I was finally feeling as if I had gotten into the groove of things. I had only made a handful of friends, and to my shock, the first time I was ever asked out on a date was a week before Valentine's Day. I felt awkward going out with a girl who I'd never spoken with before, so I turned her down. She got angry, claiming she had other options and was just being nice. That might have been the case, but her extreme reaction confused me. When I was able to, I asked my friend Travis about it. "Oh yeah, you die if you're single on Valentine's Day. Get your heart ripped out and everything. So, find a girlfriend for the day," he explained, and I scoffed at the idea. "Come on, you don't expect me to believe that, do you?" I asked. thinking he was just pulling a joke on the new kid. He acted as if he was just giving me some facts. He was looking at me as if I was crazy for not knowing about getting a date or dying. I told him he was crazy, but he just shook his head. It happens every year. Someone gets their heart ripped out. It might not be in this town, but like, it's nearby, and it's always someone single. I guess you can risk it, but why? It's just one day, he said, trying to defend his point. This was before everyone had a cell phone in their pocket, so I couldn't look up deaths of people missing their hearts right then. I made a note to research it later, so I could call him out on his urban legend. I crossed my arms, still not buying what he was saying. That's stupid. Are you saying what? Someone knows you're single and kills you? I pressed. A person doesn't do it. Some sort of monster does. No one has lived after seeing it, but people have said they've heard drums, and then found someone without their heart. Travis was again looking at me as if I should know all of this. A Valentine's Day monster? Really? Well, Christmas has Santa, and there's an Easter bunny, so why can't Valentine's Day have something? For the next 10 minutes, I roasted his idea and belief in the Valentine's Day monster. At least he could take it all as a joke, even if he did believe that the monster was real. He wasn't positive a monster was doing it, but couldn't offer up any other reason behind the deaths, and he wasn't risking it. He already had a date lined up with a girl he didn't even like. I still thought the entire idea was dumb. The rest of the school didn't share my outlook. As the days slowly got closer and closer to the fated day, the students got paired up with each other. Some done out of safety, others using the monster as an excuse to finally ask out their crush. I received a few pity offers, but I refused all of them as an act of rebellion against this stupid small town's tradition. I just watched as everyone started dating in fear of death. The stores sold out of candy and cards pretty quick. Normally everywhere would be flooded with red and pink products. The shelves were barren a few days before the 14th. Now, I refused to accept any offers, and I didn't plan on asking anyone out either. The school offered a program where you could buy sweetheart candies to be delivered to class for a small fee. I didn't mind getting my new friends one each, all while making up silly names to put on the card of who they would receive it from. It was the only thing related to the whole day I gave into, aside from buying a box of chocolates for myself. The chocolates were just a normal box of assorted types from the grocery store. I'd gotten with some money I made from doing chores. When I bought them, the cashier slapped a heart-shaped sticker on the box without my permission. A small one, for someone to write who the box was meant for. With how crazy this town was over the holiday, I didn't blame her. By that time, I'd been so overexposed to anything Valentine's related. Just seeing the sticker put me off eating the chocolates. I shoved them in my backpack to forget about them. Until after the 14th was over. I really wish I would have taken the entire thing a bit more seriously. It wasn't until the night before Valentine's Day that I finally looked up the murders, finding them to be true. Dread started to form in my stomach. As I scrolled through the library computer after school, while waiting for my father to pick me up, I didn't find all the mysterious deaths, but enough to make me worried.
3 people were found with their hearts missing. The police said from the state of their bodies, they were killed on Valentine's Day, even though their bodies weren't found right away. An entire town was warning me about this, and yet, I still sat in shock after finding out it was true. My father finally got me from school, but told me I needed to walk home the next day. I sat in the car, silently debating on what to do. He just chalked up my distressed state as normal teenage behavior. I didn't sleep that night. I tried thinking of names of students that might not have dates, all while knowing it was useless. When the clock turned midnight, it was officially the 14th. I nearly had a panic attack, convinced that the monster would sweep in and take my heart. The only way I got through that night without a mental breakdown was to shift my train of thought back to what it was before looking up the murders. A Valentine's Day monster was stupid. It wasn't real. Some heartless store manager saw the murders and made up the story to sell some more product through fear. That was it. It had to be it. I remained awake all night. In the morning, my mother noticed how I looked and offered to let me stay home. I refused, secretly hoping I could find a date if I went to school. The place was abuzz with new couples and gift exchanges. As I walked down the hallway, a few students looked at me with pity in their eyes. Most knew my single stance and how I would be the monster's top choice if it was real. No one went near me that day if they could help it. My few new friends awkwardly tried to find reasons to rush off if I tried talking to them. All of them having temporary new girlfriends gave them a good enough reason to be left out. My candy heart prank wasn't funny. Some thought it was, but I couldn't find the humor in anything that day. Instead, I spent it looking over my shoulder, expecting to hear drums at any second. The final bell rang and Travis was brave enough to walk over to me for a chat. I think he thought this was going to be our last conversation. The idea got him motivated enough to walk over, but not to find the words. "Do you, want to come over? I'm going out today, but maybe we can hang out beforehand. There's a really good show and..." He trailed off, feeling awkward. "It's fine. I'll just chill at home. My parents are going out and won't be home until after dinner, so I have the entire place to myself." That never happens. They finally think I'm old enough to be trusted to be left alone, I explained, determined to still not believe in the nonsense, even though I was terrified. Travis nodded, looking pale. He wasn't brave enough to press me on hanging out. After all, he was certain I was going to die that night. He didn't want to be around to see it. "I'll talk to you tomorrow," I said, and gave him a shaky wave. He gave one back and started to hurry over to his new girlfriend. When you're a teenager, everything's a big deal. As I walked away from school towards home, I felt like I was walking towards my own death. The sky was overcast. It made me feel even more gloomy. I kept mocking myself for my own mood. As I walked along the neighborhoods that had become familiar to me over the past few months, finding a small rock, I started to kick it as I walked, trying to take my mind off the fear in my chest. A car started to drive along behind me with such loud music, I could hear it thumping through the air. I watched it cruise by, a bit annoyed over the sound. If you're going to blast music, at least play something good, and not something that just thudded.
As the car kept going down the street, the music went with it, but a hint of the thudding remained. I stopped, confused on why I could still hear the sound if the car was so far away. When it finally turned out of sight, I realized the car wasn't the source of all of the noise. My heart started to beat so fast and hard. It matched the thudding rhythm that I could swear was getting closer and closer. I didn't look behind me, or even get angry at myself for being scared. I just ran down the street. I should have run up to one of the houses, asking for help. I was so frightened, nothing rational came to mind. I ran like crazy all while that beating followed. I wish this was a prank, but didn't stop running to find out. My mind was unable to work as my lungs burned from the mad dash. For a moment, I thought I was losing whatever was chasing me. I stumbled, nearly falling over a crooked sidewalk square in front of my house. I couldn't tell how close the thumping sound was over my heartbeat. Sweat poured down my face, and I felt faint. I slammed into my front door, banging on it, before I remembered that my parents were out. I nearly screamed in frustration. The door was locked, and my keys were buried under my books inside my backpack. That thudding sound was all I heard. It was so close it rumbled in my chest. My hands shook as I fumbled to get the zipper open. I was scared to death and couldn't keep my eyes open. Squeezing them shut, I felt around in my bag for my key. My hand brushed across it when a puff of wind came across my face. I smelled something sweet, and then the wind came again. To my horror, my mind clued into the fact it wasn't the wind, but something breathing on my face. It was too late. Even if I got my key, I couldn't unlock the door before whatever brought the heart-thumping sound took my heart too. I refused to open my eyes to see the monster I now knew to be real. I love the sound of your heart. It's a shame it's alone. Let me add it to the others. The voice that spoke wasn't some prank. It was twisted and beyond anything a human could make. My mind was racing. I felt the sharp tip of a claw poke my chest, leaving a small cut through my shirt. A cruel laugh came as I whimpered in fear. With my hand still in my backpack, I felt something that was not my books or my house key. A crazy idea came to my mind. It was either that or death, so I grabbed a hold of the only thing I could think of. Yanking the box of chocolates from my bag, I held it out to the monster. I still refused to see. My voice strained and shaking. I asked it a question I prayed would save my life. Will you be my Valentine this year? My heart nearly beat out of my chest. Opening my eyes a crack, I could see the box in my hand, but not the creature that brought along countless heartbeats that mixed in with my own. I should have died. Instead of clawing out my heart, the twisted hand with razor-sharp nails reached out and took the box. I forced my eyes shut, my entire body shaking. Something brushed my face, causing me to tense up so much it hurt. That clawed finger brushed some hair from my face, with another cruel laugh. What a cute child you are. I'll accept this gift this year. But someday I'll be back to claim your heart. I bit down on my tongue, trying not to scream at that horrible voice. With one final laugh that rattled my bones, the thudding stopped. It took me forever before I gathered up the courage to open my eyes. Nothing was on the front step. I was alone. If it wasn't for the rip in my shirt, I would have thought the whole thing came about due to the stress and lack of sleep. I didn't tell anyone what happened. I mean, who would believe me? I went to school for the first half of the day on the 15th. I had barely slept for 2 days and needed to take the rest of the day off. But I didn't want my friends to think that I died. All of them looked shocked that I lived. I just said I got lucky. The school moved on. The short-lived relationships caused by the day fizzed out. As time crept along, I started to dread knowing Valentine's Day was coming yet again. I bought more candy, roses, and a card, expecting a visit from a monster. I should have just gone along and dated someone, but somehow the idea of it was more stressful than dealing with a monster. I anticipated and feared Valentine's Day, only to have nothing happen. Nothing happens besides the fact that the gifts I addressed to the creature go missing overnight. As the years carried on, I kept buying different gifts with the same result. As I've gotten older, I've heard those terrible heartbeats faintly on Valentine's Day. Each year the sound gets louder. I think this year is finally going to be when the monster shows itself. Again, just asking someone out may save my life. But I think if the monster does show up, I'll ask it the question yet again. But this time, I will keep my eyes open. War. It's an interesting concept. In war, life is but a number, one to add to an arbitrary total that exists outside of the eventual outcome. You're not an individual. You're not a person. You're a number capable of adding or subtracting from that total. I've learned this after looking through countless records of Korea. You don't find the names of the men who fought to defend our country's rights. You see a number, 271,300, nearly 300,000 lives lost to a conflict that never should have been, 227,800 dead, 43,500 MIA on the Korean side, over 4 times the casualties of the Americans. I look at the MIA total often, a round number, calculated to the nearest 100 for ease of effort. How many men were left unaccounted for by that margin? Then I think back to the forest, those familiar faces among the trees, all tragically extinguished as they shone their brightness. And I can't help but insist that the number should have been far greater. I'm not trying to glorify my position in the war. I'm not trying to say that we fought for what was right. But I will say that I fought for my country, and I was proud to do it. I was only 20 then. I enlisted in the Korean People's Army of my own accord, despite the protest of my mother, whom I'd always hated for marrying the tyrant that was my father. But I won't be too personal here. I won't tell you how his existence impacted mine. How he used to beat me in front of his friends and laugh as they kicked dust in my mouth. How he used to soil my bed when he was drunk, and rub my face in his excrement when I accidentally laid down in it. I'm getting off track. In any case, he was the main reason I enlisted. I just needed to get away from all of it. I won't tell you about my training, because it's the same for any army, but I was deployed 7 months later. I belonged to the 2nd Division of the Ground Forces, the 14th Infantry Regiment, 3rd Section. You've never heard of it. It's because the UN had it removed from the history books after the war had ended. Why? I don't know. Maybe they thought we weren't important enough to be recognized. Maybe they wanted to erase all injustices done by North Korea. Or maybe it's because of what happened on our first mission in 1951. It was March, I recall. The bright emerald leaves were just starting to come out. After the harsh winter the army had on the battlefield. Bono Day Fury Squad. That was what we called ourselves. There were 7 of us. Our sergeant was a man by the name of G. We didn't know his full name, and we never dared ask. He was a steel-cold man, that Hollywood stereotype of a battle-hardened hero. We feared him more than any monster, and admired him more than any celebrity at the same time. He was a puzzle of a man, strict but understanding, at least during training. We knew only one thing about him, and it was that we knew nothing about him. Our sharpshooter was Hyung-wook. He was always talkative and jovial when we were eating or having a group discussion, but when he was on the battlefield, I'd never seen a more focused nor reserved person in my life. Then there was June. He was the youngest of the group, and we didn't know much about him, other than his father forced him to enlist. I deeply empathized with him, and made sure to take him under my wing. Apparently, he and Hyung-wook had known each other since elementary school. Seok-go and Seok-ju were twins, only a year older than I was. I don't remember much about them. And lastly, there was Tae. He was the sergeant's son. I often envied him for having such a noble father, one that treated him well and with respect instead of disdain. I expected him to brag and boast about his father's accomplishments, of which I was sure there were many, perhaps too many to count. But throughout our entire training and development, he never spoke a word to us of his father. After our first day in the field, we had suffered heavy losses on our side. Explosions were booming across the landscape, and bullets pelted the ground at our feet. Our battalion had lost at least 120 men, according to Hyung-wook. As we fired from the defenses, our hands calloused from clutching the T-99s, the sun began to lower below the horizon. Above the deafening crash of a mortar hitting our concrete reinforcements, I heard Sergeant G issue an order. "Break off, fall back." We looked at each other confused. Why was G ordering us away from the defense position? Our battalion needed all the help they could get. Without hesitation, we lowered our rifles and grabbed our snacks. We didn't know what would happen if we disobeyed the sergeant, and none of us wanted to find out. "Let's go." We hopped over the concrete border of our point and began trudging through the slimy grass that layered the area, all except Hyung-wook, who was still focused on sniping the enemy. "Come on, Hyung, let's go." I shouted over the hail of bullets coming from each direction. All of us, except for G and Tae of course, had practiced English extensively to intercept American messages during training, to such an extent that we spoke it solely through habit. Such was required of the youngest soldiers of the People's Army. Hyung-wook turned to look at us, ducking so that the enemy's bullets would not hit him as he stepped away. Then 2 of the bullets went through his pelvis. I don't know how they penetrated the concrete, but they did. Hyung-wook collapsed backwards in a motion of searing pain, bright red blood oozing through his fingers. The rest of the Fury Squad rushed to carry the wounded soldier. I grabbed his right arm, Jun his left, Seok-go his right leg, and Seok-ju his left. Tae stared forward in fear, gazing at the viscous red substance that was now pooling on the ground. "Tae, grab a stretcher," Seok-ju shouted. He stood there, unflinching, I expected G to stroll right over to him and smack him in the face for disobeying. But he did nothing. He simply stood there, arms crossed, tapping his boot against the mud. We had to lay Hyung-wook down on the filthy ground so Sayoko could get the stretcher. By the time he returned, he was in unbearable pain. "I can't move my legs," he grunted. We opened up his shirt and saw 2 holes, one that went clean through the top center of his belly, hitting the spine, and another that had gotten lodged somewhere in his groin. We poured solution onto his exposed wounds and wrapped them in bandages. As we struggled to lift our wounded friend, Tae simply stood there. I shot him several pleading glances to get him to help, but he was too absorbed in his fear. Then Sergeant G did something I would never forget. He walked up to our group and pulled Sayoko aside, handing him his T-38, and told him to shoot Hyung-wook. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. There was a small part of me who wanted Sayoko to follow orders, to not upset the menacing presence that was G. But that part was overwhelmed by the part that knew what a terrible act it was. Sir, Sir, I can't do this." With this remark, G's normally stern expression turned to a clear, pronounced frown. Enraged, he tore the carbine from Sayoko's nervous grasp and thrust it into his brother's hands, screaming the same awful command in his face. I expected Sayokju to refuse like his brother, but what happened next terrified me. He suddenly dropped his gaze and stared straight ahead, clutching the carbine. I could see that his white knuckles were on the verge of bleeding from the force. G moved out of the way of his stare, and for a moment he continued to look off in that direction. He didn't seem to be focusing on anything in particular. It was as if he was a statue, his eyes affixed to a natural position. Then he broke his line of sight with the nothingness and looked at his brother. He tilted his head sideways, almost like a dog examining an intruder to judge whether it's a threat. Then, he turned to look at his wounded colleague. He raised his gun and uttered a phrase of confirmation. "If you say so, sir." Even though I knew what was about to happen, I still couldn't believe my eyes when it occurred. Sayokju pulled the trigger and sent 4 bullets through Hyung-wook's heart. With this, Jun screamed and began crying. Sayoko simply stared at the act, mouth agape, astonished at what his brother had just done. Sayokju lowered the carbine and placed it in Sergeant G's awaiting hands, with a blank expression on his face. G smiled as he acknowledged the act of obedience. I rushed over to the traumatized Jun, still not quite believing what I had seen. And as I lay cradling him, wishing he didn't have to witness such a horrible act, I heard G proudly announce, "A soldier who cannot walk is a war that can't be won." As we headed off into the wooded area, leaving our colleagues unburied, the sky turned a deep shade of orange. I was able to get one last glimpse of it, before it was covered with the black branches of the still bare trees. It was so vibrant that one could barely see the streaks of mortars falling from the sky. We were forced to hike across the muddy landscape under Sergeant G's lead. His explanation for doing so, when we demanded it from him, was that we were setting up a long defense position to combat a supposed US flanking movement. I was too furious at him and Sayokju to speak. At one point, G told us to stop and make a fire. Jun, Sayokju, and I unpacked our bags to cook the tin rations, while Sayoko and Tae were to gather wood. Sergeant G said he would accompany them in order to make sure Tae got his share of work done. With him gone, Jun and I were free to discuss what we'd seen. What was that back there? Jun asked, still incredulous. "I don't want to think about it ever again," I replied. Then we both turned and stared at our colleague, who was calmly unwrapping his tin of porridge. I realized putting the murder out of my mind would be impossible when in the company of the very person who committed the act. I hadn't felt so much anger for someone since I was home with my father. Just the thought of Hyun's death brought to mind thoughts of many beatings he had incurred on me during my childhood, but I was able to put my personal life out of my head and focus on recent events. "What the hell, Seokju?" I sputtered. "How could you do that? How could you shoot your own squad member? How could you do that? How?" He continued his task, not even caring enough to look at me. "Hey you, answer me. Why did you kill him?" He turned and looked at me with the same blank expression in his eyes I'd seen when he committed the horrible act. He simply said, "He told me to." And with that, he went back to his work. Somewhere in the distance, a bomb hit the earth, sending a crack through the forest. I don't care what G said. You still killed your own friend, a fellow soldier. I was so busy screaming that I didn't notice Jun had picked up one of the rocks we were piling and was now wielding it in his hand. Before I could react, Jun was on him. The rock smashed violently into Seokju's jaw, instantly breaking it. I could hear the telltale crack of bone shattering as the rock went up and down and up and down and up and down, until there was nothing left but bone shards and blood. I pulled back Jun, who curled up in a fetal position, and cried. I couldn't control myself," he whimpered. "It's just, my father, he moaned in remorse. "It's just like what he did." "It's okay, Jun, it's okay." I hugged him, holding back his shaking arms. "My mother, she was always mistreated, always put up with it. One day, she went behind his back and made love to the neighbor's husband." He sniffed, tears beginning to roll down his dirt-crusted cheeks. "I was friends with his daughter. We were both shocked to find out. When my father found out, though, he didn't seem to be affected." He wiped his nose, burying his head in his hands. "He didn't seem to be affected when he took a shotgun to my neighbors and my friend." He sobbed again. "I was there to watch it, sang. I was playing in his yard when he just burst through the door and... He leaned over and vomited, tears streaming down his cheeks. "Seeing Hyun die reminded me of her. Just the senseless murder." I felt so much for him at that moment. I pictured my own father at home, abusing my mother. I knew he would never do such a thing. He was too cowardly. But all the mental torture he'd put me through. I wished I had the courage to do the same thing to him. To just take a rock and pummel his head till his brain spewed out all over the floor. "I don't want to fight this war, Sang," he choked. He then looked down at his blood-streaked hands and took in a gasp of air as he stared at what he'd done. All these people were fighting. They all have families too. People who love them. I killed 5 soldiers today, Sang. 6 now. I've resorted to killing my own squad. I think I'm becoming him." I wanted so badly to tell Jun it was okay, that it wasn't his fault, but I couldn't. I don't know why, but I just couldn't. I looked down at Seokju's bloody corpse. I know I should have felt a sense of remorse, like I did for Hyung-wook, but for some reason I didn't. Staring at the dead body made me almost satisfied in a way. I crouched down and began repiling the rocks for the fire pit. The planes had stopped flying overhead, and for the first time that day, there there was absolute silence. We had finished the fire pit long before Sergeant G, Tae, and Sayoko came back. They eventually materialized from the landscape, as if emerging from the trees themselves. I noticed two things right away. The first detail I noticed was that G was the only one carrying firewood. Tae was empty-handed. And the second thing was that Sayoko wasn't with them. June and I held our breaths as they approached. G arrived at the pit and dropped his bundle of logs. Tae soon joined him and sat opposite June and I. It was then that he noticed the corpse of Seokju lying off to the side. He peered at it for a moment, then turned and stared directly at June. I don't know how he knew it. I didn't have time to wonder how, because the next thing he did was walk up to me and hand me his gun. He didn't even have to speak. I knew what he wanted me to do. June knew what he wanted me to do, and Tae did nothing but stare. I took the T-38 and held it in my hands. It was strange to be holding the weapon. It emanated an aura of death, almost as if it were cursed, but I had to admit it felt solid and weighty in my possession. I stood up and looked into the distance, in the direction of the battlements from where we'd first come. I wondered if this is what it felt like to have power in life, to decide the fate of others. I wondered if my father felt this too. I wondered if he felt this when he beat me, or when he rubbed my face in his excrement. I turned to look at June's pleading expression. All the rage, all the pain I'd put up with through my life, had accumulated in that one moment. I looked at Sergeant G and saw my father. "If you say so, sir," and I pulled the trigger without hesitation. Blood splattered against the rocks. Where G's nose should have been was now a gaping hole, flesh dripping from the inside, as if it were liquid. I lowered the rifle and let it fall from my grip, and listened to it sink slightly into the loomy soil. I should mention that I hadn't killed a single US soldier in battle that day, and I'd just killed my own sergeant. The feeling that came over me was something extraordinary. There was a great pain, a searing, remorseful pang, that felt like a stab in my heart, but accompanying it was an almost joyful sensation. A fantastic satisfaction that I had rid the world of everyone else's pain. I was unburdened. I was relieved. I was happy. And then, the feeling went away, as I stared downwards and realized what I had done. I dropped to my knees in shock. I couldn't speak. I couldn't think. I could only look at my calloused hands and cry. "Don't cry, soldier." I looked up, expecting to face a conversation from June. The voice was Tae's. The son of the deceased sergeant stood up and lit a match with his fingernail, tossing it into the pit and igniting the tinder. "There's no need to feel regret over anything that happened today." I looked over to June, expecting the same astonished reaction that I had, but he was staring forward, focusing on something unseen behind Tae. War is a concept that warrants the taking of life. We kill because we see it as right. The dead did not deserve their lives. Out of my periphery, I saw June reach for the pile of guns that lay behind us. But killing is so much more than that. I could hear June grabbing one of the rifles from the pile. Killing is necessary for survival. Ironic, isn't it? I heard the fumbling of bullets being loaded into the rifle. But not only that, killing is the only punishment people will truly learn from. It's an ultimate expression of dominance. The magazine of the rifle clicked into place, and killing is merciful. for both the victim and the one holding the gun. June stood up and loaded a bullet into the chamber of his T-99. "What the hell are you talking about, Tay?" he hissed. I detected a hint of apprehension in his voice. "I think you of all people know what I'm talking about," he responded. He smiled. The fire crackled behind him. I turned to look at June, whose expression had morphed into a mixture of horror and remorse. Killing releases the monster inside us all. The fire suddenly bloomed into a full blaze, illuminating Tay's perfectly black eyes, his glistening pointed teeth, his unnatural green veins poking through his skin. Tay muttered something I didn't understand. Without hesitation, June turned the rifle towards his own face. "If you say so, sir." And with that, he pulled the trigger. Tay, or whatever had taken on the form of Tay, disappeared into the woods before June's body even hit the ground. I buried him next to Seok-ju and the sergeant. To the left of the fire pit, I watched as the sun rose above the trees, and my eyes followed a single green leaf that had fallen from above. It whistled its way down until it touched the diminishing flames of the fire and began to curl up. A plane flew overhead, the first of the day, and a mortar dropped somewhere back towards the battlements. I left all my equipment there and simply started hiking in a straight line, away from that place, away from whatever was controlling us. I don't know where it went. I don't know if it's still there. I didn't care. Eventually, I reached civilization and was able to retreat to the US-occupied South, where my English was put to good use. I may not be as deserving of the title veteran as other people. I fought in the Korean War for a day, but I fought in Korea all my life, and since then, I have never stopped fighting.